My name is Jack Turner. I'm 38 years old. This all began in the fall of 2023, a time when my past failures and losses had left me restless and searching for redemption. I had recently purchased an old RV, a relic of better times, and decided to take my wife, Sarah, our perceptive 16-year-old daughter, Lily, and my old friend Marcus Davis on a camping trip through northern Mississippi. We were headed for Tishomingo State Park and a secluded spot known by locals as Pine Ridge Hollow, hoping that the isolation of nature would provide us with solace and healing. We set out on a crisp October morning, the sky a clear blue that belied the inner storm I carried. Sarah was optimistic yet practical. She believed that reconnecting with nature might help us patch the fractures left by recent tragedies. Marcus, ever the adventurer, wore a grin that promised excitement, and Lily, quiet but curious, clutched her sketchbook as if it were her lifeline to a world filled with wonder and possibility. Our journey began smoothly enough, despite a few hiccups. The RV's engine sputtered intermittently, and our satellite phone struggled to pick up signals amid the dense foliage. I chalked it up to old machinery and the natural interference of the wilderness. I reassured everyone that minor setbacks were just part of the adventure, though deep down, I worried about what else might go wrong in these remote backwoods. After a long, winding drive through narrow, tree-lined roads, we arrived at our first stop, a clearing on the edge of Tishomingo State Park. The area was serene, dotted with towering pines and the rustling sound of leaves that seemed to whisper secrets in the wind. We set up camp with a mixture of relief and anticipation. As night fell, a chill crept into the air. I remember sitting outside the RV, trying to stoke a fire that barely kept the encroaching cold at bay, when I noticed something odd. There, carved into one of the massive oak trees, were symbols I couldn't quite decipher. They looked ancient, reminiscent of indigenous designs I'd seen in old history books. I mentioned it to Sarah and Marcus, but they dismissed it as the work of vandals or some local prankster. Lily, however, stared at the markings with wide, troubled eyes, whispering that they made her feel like she was being watched. That night, as I lay awake in the darkness listening to the RV's engine hum, I heard soft, almost imperceptible footsteps around the vehicle. At first, I convinced myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a stray dog. But then came a series of strange sounds, low murmurs, almost like distant voices carried by the wind. I sat up, heart pounding, and peeked out the window. The forest beyond was pitch black, yet I felt an unsettling presence hovering just at the edge of the light cast by our dying fire. The following morning, I tried to brush off the previous night's events. We set off for Pine Ridge Hollow, a remote area rumored among locals to be steeped in mystery and ancient lore. The RV's poor performance forced us to slow down, and tensions rose among us. Marcus's impatience clashed with my cautious nature. Sarah tried to mediate, while Lily remained silent, sketching furiously as if trying to capture a moment of foreboding. Every bump on the road felt like a jolt to my already frayed nerves. We finally reached Pine Ridge Hollow by late afternoon. The landscape was breathtaking, a rugged terrain punctuated by clusters of wild pines and rocky outcrops. It was here, amid the solitude and raw beauty of nature, that the first truly eerie signs appeared. While gathering firewood, I stumbled upon large, unidentifiable footprints near a shallow stream. They were far too big to belong to any local animal I knew of, and their shape was disturbingly human yet distorted, as if carved by an unseen force. That evening, as dusk settled and the temperature plummeted, the forest came alive with strange sounds. I was on watch outside the RV when I first saw her, a spectral figure moving silently between the trees. She was dressed in a flowing white gown that seemed to glow under the moonlight, her face obscured by shadows. I froze, heart hammering in my chest, as she drifted closer, her eyes like voids filled with sorrow and accusation. I couldn't tell if she was trying to communicate or if she was a mere harbinger of doom. I called out, but my voice came out as a mere whisper, swallowed by the oppressive silence of the forest. The following morning, the tension among our group was palpable. Sarah, ever the pragmatist, suggested that we chalk the ghostly encounter up to stress and exhaustion. Marcus, however, was more brazen. "Maybe it's a local legend come to life," he joked, though his eyes betrayed genuine concern. Lily, who had been quiet since the apparition, finally spoke up, insisting that the markings on the trees and the footprints were connected, symbols of an ancient warning. I felt a chill as I recalled the indigenous legends I'd read about. Stories of vengeful spirits and guardians of sacred lands, wronged by colonizers and now seeking retribution. Over the next few days, our equipment began to fail in earnest. The RV's engine coughed and spluttered, and our communication devices flickered with static. It felt as if nature itself was conspiring to isolate us further. Our food supplies dwindled, and every attempt to leave the clearing was thwarted by sudden downpours and treacherous, mud-slicked roads. The isolation and the mounting supernatural incidents pushed us into a state of heightened alertness, where every rustle in the underbrush could mean danger. One night, as a fierce storm raged outside, the atmosphere inside the RV was equally turbulent. Marcus and I were embroiled in a heated argument about our next steps. He wanted to press on into the heart of the forest, driven by a reckless need to confront whatever haunted us, while I argued for retreat and safety. Sarah tried to calm us, but her words were drowned out by the relentless pounding of the rain. Lily, huddled in a corner with her sketchbook, looked on in fear, her eyes pleading for a solution none of us could offer. Amid the clamor of the storm, I found myself awake on the roof of the RV, seeking solace in the rain. That's when I heard it. A series of guttural chants carried on the wind. They were not human sounds, but something far more primal and ancient. The voices ebbed and flowed in a dissonant rhythm, and with each chant, the temperature around me dropped further. I felt a presence, a dark, oppressive force that seemed to gather strength from our isolation. The moment was so charged with dread that I barely dared to breathe. By the time the storm subsided, the supernatural activity had escalated. We began to experience unexplainable phenomena. Objects moved on their own, and shadows flitted at the edge of our vision. Then came the terrifying revelation. One morning, as we gathered what little food we had left, Marcus went missing. In a frantic search, we discovered his RV door left ajar, his belongings scattered across the floor. I found his notebook, its pages filled with frantic scribbles and notes about the Guardian and ancient retribution. I knew then that Marcus had encountered something unspeakable. Desperate for answers, I recalled vague mentions of local folklore and decided to consult an old family journal that my grandmother had kept, a relic of our own history that detailed indigenous legends and rituals. The journal spoke of a spirit, a guardian wronged by the exploitation of sacred lands, merging the traits of a banshee, a witch, and even hints of a vengeful devil. It was said that this spirit would first appear as a silent watcher, offering warning through eerie symbols and spectral apparitions. But if disrespected or provoked, it would unleash its wrath with violent force. I shared these findings with Sarah and Lily. Though skeptical at first, Sarah's pragmatic side slowly accepted the possibility that what we were experiencing was not merely the product of isolation and exhaustion. Determined to find a way to pacify this ancient force, Sarah reached out to a local folklorist, a community elder who was well versed in indigenous traditions. The elder, A wiry man named Elijah arrived with a weathered leather satchel and a grave demeanor. He explained that the spirit was indeed a guardian of sacred land, angered by the desecration of ancient burial sites and the exploitation of natural resources. Elijah spoke in hushed tones about a ritual that could honor the wronged ancestors and restore balance to the land. Despite our misgivings, we decided that we had no other choice but to follow his guidance. That night, under a sky smudged with dark clouds and a waxing moon, we made our way to a clearing deep within the forest, a place Elijah described as the heart of the land's old power. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by our cautious footsteps. There, in the center of the clearing, Elijah arranged a circle of ancient stones and offered us ritual items: a bundle of sage, a carved wooden talisman, and a small bowl of water drawn from a nearby spring believed to be blessed by ancestral spirits. He instructed us on the ritual. We were to speak words of apology and respect to the land, to honor the spirits of those who had been wronged. As we took our places in the circle, the wind seemed to hold its breath, and the oppressive atmosphere deepened. I remember the moment vividly. As I spoke the incantation, my voice trembling in the cold night air, I could feel a shift in the energy around us. The spectral figure of the white-dressed woman reappeared at the edge of the circle, her eyes filled with sorrow and something darker, an anger that hinted at impending violence. For a moment, time seemed to slow. The spirit moved closer, its form wavering like a reflection in disturbed water. Then, without warning, the atmosphere exploded into chaos. The spirit's presence became violently retributive. Shadows coalesced into dark, twisting forms that attacked with a ferocity that left us scrambling for cover. I remember trying to shield Sarah and Lily as the force of the supernatural onslaught slammed into us. The ritual, meant to appease the guardian, had inadvertently drawn its full wrath. In the ensuing struggle, I caught a glimpse of Marcus, terrified and bleeding, as he stumbled into the clearing. It was then that I realized the true nature of our plight. The guardian was not simply an eerie presence that hung around like a silent watcher. It was dangerous, and it did not hesitate to exact its revenge on those it deemed disrespectful. Marcus was caught in the violent surge of energy. I fought desperately to drag him away, but the force was too great. In the chaos, a burst of raw supernatural energy struck him down, and his lifeless body fell to the ground. A stark, agonizing reminder of the price we might pay for intruding on sacred lands. The loss of Marcus shattered our resolve. Amid the screams of the wind and the relentless onslaught of shadowy apparitions, Sarah and I clung to each other, while Lily sobbed quietly in a corner, her sketchbook forgotten. The violent encounter left us physically and emotionally broken, our attempts at the ritual having only angered the spirit further. Elijah, his face ashen, urged us to complete the ritual, to show that our intentions were pure and that we respected the ancient traditions. Tears streaming down my face, I gathered what little strength I had left and resumed the incantation, my voice hoarse from grief and fear. Sarah, with trembling hands, added her own words of apology, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. Lily, despite her terror, joined in, her young voice quivering but determined. In that moment, the clearing became a battlefield between our mortal desperation and the ancient, indomitable will of the land. For what felt like an eternity, the darkness pressed in around us. Then, gradually, the violent energy began to recede. The spectral figure of the white-dressed woman paused, her form wavering as if caught in a moment of sorrowful indecision. Slowly, she turned away, dissolving into the mist that began to roll in from the surrounding forest. The oppressive chill lifted just enough for us to sense that the ritual had, at least temporarily, pacified the furious guardian. In the eerie silence that followed, Elijah knelt beside Marcus's still form. His eyes were filled with a mixture of grief and resignation as he explained that the spirit's retribution was final. The guardian had taken one life to restore balance. We gathered Marcus's body with heavy hearts, knowing that nothing we could do would bring him back. The loss left an indelible scar, a reminder that nature's ancient forces were not to be trifled with. We spent the remainder of that night huddled together in the RV, the events of the clearing replaying in my mind like a nightmare on endless loop. The isolation of the backwoods, once a promised refuge, had become a crucible of terror and loss. The supernatural presence, though seemingly subdued for the moment, lingered in the shadows, a silent sentinel waiting for any further transgressions. In the days that followed, we packed up the RV and began the long, painful journey home. The roads out of Pine Ridge Hollow were treacherous, and our already fragile equipment continued to betray us with mechanical failures and sporadic loss of signal. Sarah and I hardly spoke, the weight of our shared trauma leaving us lost in our own silent reflections. Lily, once vibrant and curious, now clung to the corners of her sketchbook, each drawing a somber record of the horrors we had witnessed. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of a figure in the corner of my eye, a flash of white or the ghostly outline of a woman, and for a moment I'd feel the cold prick of fear. I knew that our encounter with the Guardian had changed us irrevocably. The balance between human progress and the sanctity of ancient land had been violently disturbed, and the price of that disturbance had been paid in blood and sorrow. Now, as I sit at my kitchen table trying to piece together the fragments of memory, I often wonder if we truly understood what we had trespassed upon. The backwoods of northern Mississippi, with their rugged beauty and hidden secrets, remain a place where ancient powers still linger. I have learned that some forces are beyond our control, forces that demand respect and sacrifice from those who dare to encroach upon their domain. I carry Marcus's memory with me every day, a stark reminder that not all legends are mere stories, and not every spirit can be appeased by human words alone. The experience has reshaped my understanding of survival. It's not just about physical endurance against nature's harsh elements, but also about the courage to face the unseen, the ancient, and the unforgiving. In the aftermath of that harrowing journey, I have grown quieter, more introspective. I now take my time when planning any venture into nature's vast wilderness. I've learned to listen not only to the sounds of the wind and the rustling leaves, but also to the subtle language of the land, a language that warns of transgressions and demands reverence. Sarah has become my steadfast partner in this new way of life, her pragmatic strength balancing my own haunted introspection. Lily, too, has changed. Her art, once a mere pastime, has become a silent chronicle of our ordeal, a series of sketches filled with shadows, symbols, and spectral figures that hint at the secrets of the ancient woods. Looking back, I realize that the journey was never merely about escaping our personal demons. It was also about confronting a legacy of history and spirituality that defies modern explanation. The Guardian of Pine Ridge Hollow, with its spectral presence and vengeful outbursts, reminded us that the land carries with it memories of countless souls and centuries of untold stories. It is a place where survival is measured not only in the strength of our bodies, but also in the resilience of our spirit and our capacity for respect. Now, whenever I hear the rustle of wind through pine needles or see the flicker of light at the edge of my vision, I am reminded of that cold night in the clearing, a night when ancient forces and human frailties collided. I know that somewhere out there, in the quiet depths of the backwoods, the guardian remains vigilant, a living embodiment of nature's enduring power and mystery. And I have learned, sometimes too late, that to truly survive in the wilderness, one must learn to live in harmony with the spirits of the past. This is my story, a tale of isolation, terror, and the bittersweet lessons learned from the dark pines of northern Mississippi. May it serve as a reminder that some paths once trodden leave marks on the soul that never fully fade away. My name is Dylan Cooper, and I'm 45 years old. This happened in the fall of 2023 when grief and guilt had become constant companions since my divorce and the heartbreaking loss of my younger brother. In a desperate bid to escape the suffocating memories and find some semblance of healing, I decided to take my battered RV on a solitary journey through northern Mississippi. I was drawn to the rugged beauty of the backwoods, hoping that the silence and raw nature might help me face the demons that had long haunted me. I set off one cool October morning, the sky painted in a wash of pale blue that contrasted sharply with the heavy emotions swirling inside me. The RV, an old, creaky vehicle with more personality than mechanical reliability, rumbled along narrow, tree-lined roads that wound their way through the countryside. The engine coughed and sputtered occasionally, but I reassured myself that this was simply the price of venturing into the unknown. My destination was twofold. I was headed toward Chickasaw State Park for a brief respite, and then onward to an isolated area known by locals as Old Pine Hollow. I had heard whispers about that place, a site steeped in local folklore, where lost souls might wander, and the past seemed to linger in every rustling leaf. I wasn't sure if those tales were true, but in my state of mind I welcomed the possibility of encountering something beyond the ordinary. As the miles melted away, I found myself increasingly alone with my thoughts. The radio played low-key country tunes, and the hum of the engine became a sort of droning lullaby to my troubled mind. I recalled the arguments, the heartbreak, and the long nights of regret. Every mile that passed felt like a step away from the unbearable weight of my past. Arriving at Chickasaw State Park late in the morning, I parked the RV on a small, unused lot near the edge of a dense forest. I spent a few quiet hours wandering the trails, trying to clear my mind. The park was peaceful, a welcome respite from the inner turmoil, but as the afternoon wore on, a restlessness began to creep in. I wasn't ready to face my solitude just yet, so I resumed my journey toward Old Pine Hollow. The road grew rougher as I drove deeper into the more remote parts of the state. The RV's old engine began to protest more frequently, and I had to pull over several times to check the coolant and tighten loose bolts. Each stop brought a mix of irritation and resigned acceptance. I was well aware that this journey was as much about confronting my physical limitations as it was about addressing the wounds of my heart. That first night at Old Pine Hollow, I set up camp in a clearing surrounded by towering pines and gnarled oak trees. The wind whispered through the branches, and the darkness pressed in like a heavy, velvety blanket. I made a modest fire outside the RV, its flickering flames doing little to dispel the creeping cold. I sat silently, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee and listening to the forest's nocturnal symphony. It wasn't long before the eerie signs began. At first, I heard soft, indistinct whispers carried on the wind, words that I couldn't quite make out, but that seemed almost familiar. I told myself it was the rustle of the leaves or the distant call of an owl, but deep down, a chill ran through me. Then came the lights. From the corner of my eye, I saw flickers of pale, ethereal illumination dancing among the trees. They moved slowly, deliberately, as if guiding me toward something I wasn't ready to understand. The next day, While I was checking the RV's engine, as a mechanical grumble's now a constant reminder of my isolation, I discovered something even more unsettling. Near the back of the vehicle, partly hidden under a blanket of fallen leaves, lay a small, antique pendant. It was intricately designed, unmistakably old, and oddly warm to the touch despite the cool autumn air. I couldn't recall ever owning such a piece. The pendant bore the insignia of a family crest, one I faintly remembered from childhood stories of ancestors who had once roamed these lands. A prickle of both dread and nostalgia ran down my spine. That evening, as dusk settled over Old Pine Hollow, I took a long walk away from the RV. I needed time to think, to piece together the fragments of my memories with the strange occurrences of the past day. The forest was alive with the murmurs of unseen voices, and the gentle light of the setting sun lent everything an otherworldly glow. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being led somewhere, perhaps toward a truth I had long been avoiding. My nights became a blend of restless sleep and vivid dreams. I dreamt of my brother, of a time when we laughed and planned our futures together, only for those dreams to turn sour with visions of ghostly figures and unexplained apparitions. In these dreams, I often saw a luminous figure, a woman with kind eyes and a sorrowful smile, whose presence felt both comforting and accusatory. I awoke drenched in sweat, the boundary between dream and reality blurring into an inescapable haze. As the days passed, the supernatural manifestations grew increasingly persistent. There were nights when I would wake up to find personal items, old photographs, a notebook filled with my thoughts, subtly rearranged. The RV's lights flickered in rhythm with what sounded like distant chanting, a rhythmic murmur that resonated deep within my soul. At times, I caught fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures just beyond the edge of my vision, as if the forest itself were populated by echoes of a forgotten past. I began to wonder if these occurrences were merely hallucinations born of solitude and grief. But the more I tried to dismiss them, the more real they felt. One particularly stormy night, when the wind howled like the cries of a long-lost spirit and rain pounded the roof of the RV, I stepped outside to seek refuge under a massive oak. In that moment, the darkness seemed to part, revealing a figure bathed in a gentle, otherworldly light. It was the luminous apparition from my dreams, the face of someone I once loved and lost, radiating both warmth and sorrow. I couldn't speak. My heart pounded so fiercely that every breath felt like a struggle. The figure raised a hand, and in that silent gesture I felt a profound invitation, a call to confront my past and seek the healing I had been so desperately avoiding. Shaken to my core, I returned to the RV and rifled through an old box of keepsakes. There, hidden at the bottom, I found a family heirloom, a delicate silver locket engraved with the same insignia as the pendant. My mind raced with memories of family lore and whispered legends of ancestors who had once guarded sacred lands in these very woods. I recalled stories of gentle spirits that appeared to those burdened by grief, offering them a chance to mend their broken hearts by reconnecting with the past. Determined to understand the significance of these signs, I sought out local lore from the sparse community around Old Pine Hollow. I managed to track down a retired teacher named Mrs. Jenkins, who was known for her deep knowledge of the region's history and legends. Over a cup of weak coffee in her creaking, time-worn kitchen, she explained that the apparitions were said to be manifestations of lost souls, a gentle but persistent presence that visited those in mourning. According to her, the spirits of the past wandered these woods to guide the living toward reconciliation with their inner turmoil. Armed with this new perspective, I began to see my supernatural encounters not as malevolent forces, but as echoes of my own sorrow, a call to embrace the memories of those I had lost and to find forgiveness within myself. Each night, as I sat by the dying embers of my campfire, I spoke softly into the darkness, reciting long-forgotten prayers and apologies to the spirits of my family. I imagined my brother's kind face and the gentle smile of the apparition, both urging me to let go of my guilt. Yet, not every moment was suffused with a sense of gentle guidance. One late night, as the wind rattled the thin metal of the RV and the rain hammered relentlessly on the roof, I experienced a moment of stark terror. I was jolted awake by a piercing sound, a cry that echoed through the trees like a lamentation of pure anguish. In the immediate darkness outside, I saw fleeting shapes that dissolved as quickly as they appeared, leaving me with the grim realization that these spectral visitations were not always benign. The voices grew louder, more insistent, whispering fragments of old stories and long-buried regrets. Despite the terror that gripped me, I resolved not to run from these experiences. I recognized that they were a part of me, reflections of a life marked by loss and the inescapable passage of time. I clutched the silver locket, feeling its cool metal against my skin, and made a silent vow to embrace whatever truth these apparitions sought to impart. I began to record my experiences in a battered journal, detailing each whisper, each flicker of light, and each glimpse of the spectral figures that haunted the nights. One evening, driven by an overwhelming need for closure, I decided to follow the elusive lights that seemed to beckon me deeper into the forest. The moon was a thin crescent in the dark sky, casting a pale glow over the landscape. I left the relative safety of the RV and walked along a narrow, winding path that led toward a clearing I had never seen before. The forest seemed to close in around me, and every snap of a twig underfoot sent my heart racing. In the center of the clearing stood an ancient stone altar, weathered by time and covered in moss. The altar was adorned with carvings that echoed the symbols I had seen on trees near the RV. As I approached, I felt the presence of something profoundly old and powerful. A guardian spirit, perhaps, whose duty was to watch over these sacred grounds. I laid the silver locket gently on the altar and whispered a heartfelt apology for the sins of my past, not just for the loss of my brother, but for every regret that had plagued my soul. The atmosphere shifted. A soft, almost imperceptible glow began to emanate from the altar, and the wind picked up, swirling around me as if in answer. I stood transfixed as the luminous figure reappeared, hovering near the altar. This time her eyes were not just sorrowful but filled with a deep understanding, a silent forgiveness. In that moment, I realized that the apparition, the locket, and even the strange recurring signs were all part of a process of healing. The spirit was not a harbinger of doom, but a gentle guide urging me to confront my deepest wounds and, ultimately, to let go. Over the following days, the intensity of the supernatural encounters gradually waned. The nightly whispers became softer, like the rustling of leaves, and the ghostly lights faded into the background of a forest returning to its natural rhythms. I spent my remaining time in Old Pine Hollow in quiet reflection, meticulously repairing my RV and making small improvements to its aging systems. A symbolic act of mending not just a machine, but a heart battered by sorrow. I left the clearing with a sense of renewal. The journey through northern Mississippi had been far more than an escape from my past. It had been a pilgrimage into the depths of my soul. I drove away slowly, the battered RV rolling over the rough, unpaved roads, and I carried with me the weight of my experiences, a weight that had transformed into a quiet resolve. I understood now that healing was not a destination, but an ongoing journey, much like the endless winding roads of the backwoods I had traveled. As I crossed back into civilization, I continued to keep the silver locket close, a talisman of a bittersweet encounter that had taught me the value of facing one's grief head-on. I often revisited the old journal, reading the words of despair alongside the recorded signs of hope. And each time I did, I felt a profound connection to the gentle spirits that had guided me through the darkness. Now, whenever I find myself alone on a quiet night, the memory of those spectral visitations comes rushing back. I hear the soft whispers of the wind and sea in the half-light, the faint outline of a figure that reminds me of the guardian of Old Pine Hollow. But rather than filling me with terror, these memories now comfort me, a reminder that even in our darkest moments, the past can guide us toward a brighter, more compassionate future. This is my story, a tale of solitude, sorrow, and ultimately healing. I learned that the spirits we encounter, whether born of myth or the echo of our own grief, are there not to condemn us but to remind us of the importance of forgiveness and the enduring power of love. The backwoods of northern Mississippi, with their haunting beauty and timeless secrets, taught me that sometimes the most profound journeys are those we take within ourselves, and that even the most painful memories can, in time, become the seeds of new beginnings. Looking back now, I no longer view the strange lights, whispered voices, and gentle apparitions as threats. Instead, I see them as fragments of a long-forgotten conversation, a dialogue between the living and the lost, a reminder that we are all bound by the same threads of memory and emotion. And while I know that the road to healing is never truly complete, I also know that I now possess the strength to continue moving forward, one quiet mile at a time. In the end, the ghosts of my past were not demons to be feared, but echoes of love and loss, gently urging me to embrace the impermanence of life and to honor every moment, no matter how painful, because it is those moments that shape who we become. My name is Jonathan Carter. I'm 42 years old, and this is the story of a vacation that nearly cost my family our lives. It all happened during our long-anticipated RV trip along the historic Natchez Trace Parkway in northern Mississippi, a journey that was meant to heal old wounds and bring us closer together. Instead, it forced us to confront both our inner demons and a supernatural terror that defied explanation. The planning had been simple enough. After a series of personal setbacks, my own deep-seated guilt over past mistakes and a lingering sense of inadequacy as a father, I convinced my wife, Rebecca, Becky to her friends, that a family getaway might offer us the fresh start we desperately needed. Becky, always intuitive and empathetic, had hesitated but ultimately agreed, driven by a hope that nature's quiet solace might heal the fractures in our family. Our kids, 14-year-old Sam and 10-year-old Lily, were excited in their own ways. Sam, with his rebellious streak and an insatiable curiosity about the unknown, was already scheming his adventures, while Lily, quiet and observant, had a mysterious sensitivity that had often frightened me with its uncanny accuracy. Our RV was an aging model, its exterior worn by many travels, and its generator known to fail at the most inconvenient times. Still, it represented our chance to escape the relentless buzz of modern life and the haunting memories of the past. We set off on a bright morning, the promise of reconnecting and healing hanging in the air like the soft Mississippi mist. But as we drove deeper into the winding back roads that lead to the Natchez Trace, I couldn't shake the feeling that fate had chosen this journey for reasons far darker than mere family bonding. After hours on the road, we finally arrived at our remote campsite nestled along the ancient stretch of the parkway. The area was breathtakingly beautiful, with towering oaks and the quiet murmur of distant streams. Yet there was something else, a lingering aura of history and sorrow that seemed to seep from the very ground. I remember stepping out of the RV and noticing strange symbols carved into the nearby trees. They weren't random scratches, but deliberate markings, resembling indigenous runes that, according to local lore, were meant to ward off dark forces. I mentioned it to Becky, who shivered as she touched one of the carvings lightly. "These symbols, they feel like a warning," she whispered, her eyes reflecting a mix of wonder and dread. I tried to laugh it off, attributing it to overactive imaginations fueled by isolation. But deep inside, a seed of unease was already taking root. That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the RV's generator sputtered and died, plunging us into darkness. Our cell phones lost all signal, leaving us isolated from the rest of the world. The only sound was the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze, and an inexplicable distant laughter that only Lily seemed to notice. I first heard it when I was double-checking the generator. A soft giggle, reminiscent of children playing, drifted in from the woods. I called out, but only silence answered. Later, while preparing dinner over a small portable stove, I glanced out the window and saw fleeting shadows flitting between the trees. I dismissed them as tricks of the light, but Lily's wide eyes told me otherwise. Lily had always been different. While other children played without a care, she often sat silently, lost in a world that seemed to whisper secrets to her. That night, she clutched her favorite doll as she murmured about invisible friends, who were not quite as friendly as they appeared. Her soft, frightened whispers sent chills down my spine. I tried to reassure her, but the unease in her voice made it impossible to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next morning, tensions began to rise. Becky, who had been steadily growing more anxious, insisted that we explore the area to understand these ominous signs. I argued that we should stay put until the generator was fixed, but she was insistent. Sam, ever the adventurer, saw an opportunity to uncover a mystery, and despite my warnings, he slipped away from the campsite, promising to be back soon. That afternoon, while I was attempting to jury-rig a temporary fix on the RV's electrical system, Becky confided in me about a conversation she had overheard from a neighboring camper the previous night. In hushed tones, the camper had spoken of a local legend, a mysterious figure that roamed these woods. According to local lore, this figure was an evil spirit, rooted in indigenous curses that could assume human form and mimic the faces of those it encountered. I dismissed it as folklore, yet a part of me couldn't ignore the similarity to the eerie symbols we'd found etched in the trees. Family tensions flared. Becky's insistence on following her intuition clashed with my desperate need for rational explanations. Every creak of the RV and rustle in the woods amplified the growing divide between us. Sam's absence only deepened my worry, and I found myself torn between the protective instincts of a father and the pragmatic approach of a man who believed in tangible realities. As dusk fell on the second night, the atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive. I was outside the RV checking on our supplies when I heard it again, the distant sound of children's laughter, now more insistent, almost beckoning. My heart pounded as I scanned the dark tree line. It was then that I saw a figure, a shifting, indistinct humanoid form that seemed to blur at the edges, as if made of smoke and shadows. The figure moved with an unnatural fluidity, pausing as if to assess me before vanishing into the darkness. I rushed back to the RV where Becky was already awake, her eyes wide with terror. "It's here," she whispered, trembling. "I know it's here. I feel it." I tried to convince her that it was our minds playing tricks on us, but deep down I feared that what we had witnessed was no mere illusion. At that moment, Sam burst through the door, his face a mixture of excitement and fear. "Dad, you have to see this," he exclaimed, recounting his venture into the woods earlier. He had followed the eerie sounds, and what he encountered was far worse than we had imagined. A brief, terrifying glimpse of the creature, its form contorting into shapes that were both human and monstrous. The realization struck us all at once. This was no harmless ghost or fleeting apparition. The entity was dangerous, and its violence was not in question. I recalled the whispered accounts from local campers about a fatal incident. A hiker had once tried to confront this spirit and never returned. It was clear that our presence had somehow stirred an ancient force, one with roots deep in indigenous curses and historical injustices. Desperation gave way to a fragile resolve. Becky, despite her mounting fear, began to piece together clues from an old journal we discovered tucked away in a forgotten corner of the RV. The journal belonged to a previous traveler, a man who had recorded his encounters with the spirit. It detailed a traditional ritual, one that blended indigenous practices with desperate human ingenuity to either appease or repel the entity. The ritual was dangerous and its success was never guaranteed, but it was our only hope. As the night deepened, we gathered what little equipment we had. The journal instructed us to collect natural elements: a bundle of oak branches, some wild sage, and a few drops of water from a clear stream nearby. Sam, using his tech-savvy nature, fashioned a crude audio device from spare parts found in the RV. His plan was to mimic the natural sounds of the forest, soothing, rhythmic noises that might distract the spirit and buy us precious moments to perform the ritual. Lily, with her unique sensitivity, became our inadvertent guide. Despite her young age, she sensed the shifts in the spirit's mood. A subtle change in the air, a slight alteration in the sounds around us. "It's angry now," she said in a barely audible voice, clinging to Becky's hand. Her insight was invaluable, and though I worried for her safety, I knew that her gift might be the key to our survival. Under a sky pierced by a cold, indifferent moon, we moved to the clearing where the journal had indicated the ritual must be performed. The clearing was eerie in its stillness, the trees surrounding it etched with the same cryptic symbols we had seen near the campsite. I took a deep breath and, with trembling hands, began to arrange the oak branches into a circle. Becky, reciting incantations from the journal in a voice that wavered between desperation and determination, sprinkled wild sage into the air. The atmosphere grew charged with an energy that bordered on the palpable. Suddenly, the forest fell eerily silent, and then it happened. The entity emerged. The spirit, now unmistakably present, manifested as a fluid, shifting mass that could barely be described as human. Its form blurred between a gentle, almost mournful visage and a terrifying contorted mask of fury. I could see fleeting, distorted images of faces, perhaps those of victims from the past, or worse, echoes of our own expressions. The spirit's appearance was accompanied by a violent gust of wind that nearly knocked us off our feet. In that moment, I realized that this was no passive haunting. This was a malevolent force that intended to destroy us. The journal had warned that those who had dared to confront it before had often paid with their lives. I felt a cold dread as I recalled the local legend of the hiker who had perished trying to intervene. A stark reminder that death was not a distant possibility but an imminent threat. In the ensuing chaos, our makeshift device, which Sam had painstakingly assembled, began to emit a low, rhythmic hum, mimicking the natural sounds of the forest. The eerie melody seemed to momentarily distract the spirit, its shifting form wavering as if caught in a trance. Taking advantage of this brief respite, Becky continued the ritual, her voice growing steadier with each recitation, as if tapping into an ancient power that transcended our modern understanding. The battle for survival. For what felt like an eternity, we fought against the darkness that had invaded our lives. The spirit, enraged by our defiance, lashed out with bursts of supernatural force. Branches snapped and debris flew through the air as the clearing became a battleground between human determination and otherworldly malevolence. I felt a searing pain as a gust of wind slammed into me, knocking me to the ground. In that moment of vulnerability, I clutched at Becky's hand and prayed that we could hold on a little longer. Lily's soft, instinctual guidance became our beacon. "It's coming back," she warned in a trembling whisper. Her words spurred us on, even as I could see the strain etched on Becky's face. Sam, despite his earlier bravado, now looked every bit the frightened teenager as he scrambled to adjust the device, hoping that the sounds it emitted would continue to stave off the spirit's relentless assault. The battle reached its peak when the spirit, in a burst of violent energy, surged forward. I saw in its swirling mass a face, one that resembled my own, twisted in agony and rage. It was as if the entity was reaching into our souls, attempting to drag us into the abyss of its cursed existence. With every fiber of my being, I fought against the terror, channeling all my strength to push back against the darkness. Becky's voice rose above the chaos, her incantations gaining power as if fed by the very spirit of the forest. The ancient runes carved into the trees around us seemed to glow faintly in response, their light a silent witness to the battle unfolding before us. In that charged moment, I realized that our only hope was to complete the ritual, to close the gateway between our world and the one the spirit inhabited. With one final desperate push, we synchronized our efforts. Sam's device reached a crescendo, its eerie melody filling the clearing with a resonant, pulsating sound that seemed to harmonize with the incantations. Becky, her eyes glistening with tears and determination, shouted the final words from the journal. A brilliant, blinding light exploded from the circle of oak branches, enveloping us in a protective glow. When the light finally faded, the clearing was eerily silent once again. The spirit was gone, banished for now by the power of the ritual and our collective resolve. The aftermath, however, left a deep impression on us all. The physical scars were minor, but the emotional and psychological toll was immeasurable. I helped Becky to her feet, and we gathered our shaken children close, our hearts pounding in a shared rhythm of relief and lingering fear. In the days that followed, we remained at the campsite, hesitant to leave until the sense of dread had fully lifted. Local authorities eventually arrived, albeit skeptically, to investigate the series of strange events reported in the area. Their disbelief only deepened our resolve to understand the truth behind the indigenous curse and the malevolent force we had encountered. I spent long, sleepless nights poring over the old journal and speaking with the neighboring campers who had shared their own chilling encounters. It became clear that our experience was part of a long, tragic tapestry, a curse born of historical injustices against native peoples, a curse that had now found new victims in our modern world. Despite the terror we had endured, the experience forged an unbreakable bond between my family and a renewed understanding of our place in a world that is far more mysterious and dangerous than we ever imagined. Looking back, I often wonder if that fateful trip along the Natchez Trace was a punishment for my past mistakes, or a cruel twist of fate meant to teach me the value of true courage and family unity. The experience left an indelible mark on all of us. I became more determined than ever to make amends for my past, to be a better father, and to cherish every moment with my family. Becky, whose intuitive nature had always set her apart, embraced her newfound belief in the supernatural and began researching more about indigenous folklore and rituals. Sam, once reckless in his pursuit of adventure, matured rapidly, his eyes now reflecting the wisdom of someone who had narrowly escaped the clutches of death. And little Lily, with her quiet, uncanny sensitivity, became our silent guardian. a reminder that sometimes the most unassuming souls hold the greatest power. Even now, as I write these words, I can still hear that faint echo of children's laughter in the stillness of the night, a reminder of the spirit we faced and the precarious balance between our world and the next. The Natchez Trace remains a place of beauty and ancient mystery, a silent testament to the... We eventually left the campsite, our RV chugging along the winding roads out of northern Mississippi. But the memories of that night, the flashing symbols, the violent wind, the ghostly visage of our own reflections, never left us. I often drive by familiar stretches of the Natchez Trace, and for a fleeting moment, I wonder if the spirit might one day return, hungry for revenge, or merely following its ancient, cursed cycle. My family and I carry those scars with us, not just as marks of survival, but as reminders that in the vast tapestry of history our lives are intertwined with legends and curses that defy simple explanations. And while I hope never to encounter such darkness again, I remain forever changed, ever watchful of the shadows that lurk in the corners of our world. This is my story, a story of terror, love, and the unyielding will to survive when faced with the unknown. My name is Jonathan Carter, and what happened on that fateful trip along the Natchez Trace reshaped my understanding of reality, forcing me to confront the ancient evils that still haunt our modern lives. I share it now in the hope that it serves as a cautionary tale. For those who venture into the remote, storied lands of northern Mississippi, be wary of the silent symbols carved into ancient trees, the sudden failure of modern conveniences, and the disembodied voices that whisper in the dark. Sometimes the past is not dead. It waits, hidden in the mists of time, ready to reclaim what it believes was lost. In the end, our survival was not just a matter of physical endurance, but a test of faith, intuition, and the unbreakable bond of family. And as I continue to navigate the precarious balance between the known and the unknown, I carry with me the lesson that some forces are best left undisturbed, and that the greatest strength lies in the love and unity that holds us together, even in the face of unimaginable horror. My name is Michael Donovan. I'm 38 years old, and this happened in the early autumn of 2023 at Tishomingo State Park, Mississippi. I had been struggling with a gnawing guilt from a personal tragedy, a loss that still haunted my every step, and I sought refuge in solitude. I thought that a long, solitary RV camping trip might help me piece together my scattered self, but nothing could have prepared me for the secrets that Tishomingo held. I had spent weeks planning my escape from the suffocating memories of my old life. My RV, a battered but reliable vehicle that had seen better days, was my only companion. Its worn exterior and creaking engine bore witness to countless miles traveled in search of solace. As I drove along the back roads that led to Tishomingo State Park, I felt a tentative hope that the isolation of nature might somehow dull the edge of my inner pain. Yet, even as I pressed on, I couldn't shake the feeling that fate had steered me here for reasons far beyond simple escape. After a long, uneventful drive through twisting forest roads and over ancient rock formations, I finally arrived at a remote clearing within the park. The place was hauntingly beautiful, a quiet oasis amid towering pines and rugged outcroppings. The air was crisp, and the fading light of dusk painted long shadows on the ground. I set up camp near a small, bubbling stream, grateful for the silence that promised a respite from my memories. No sooner had I begun to settle in than I noticed something odd. While walking a short trail near my RV, I came across a series of strange symbols carved into the bark of a massive oak tree. The marks were deliberate, not the random scratches of a bored vandal. They resembled ancient, cryptic warnings. inscriptions that seemed to echo some long-forgotten indigenous lore. I paused, running my fingers over the rough carvings, a shiver crawling up my spine as the significance of those symbols whispered in my mind. The next morning, after a restless night where I had been disturbed by distant, unplaceable murmurs, I returned to my RV only to find an unexpected note attached to the door. The paper was old, its edges frayed, and the handwriting was uneven yet urgent. The note read, "You have come seeking solace, but the past is not easily forgotten. There lies a secret in these woods, a secret of loss and disappearance. Find the truth, and you may find redemption." No signature, no indication of who might have left it. I stared at it in disbelief. Had someone known my pain? Or was it simply a remnant of a local legend, intended to unsettle unsuspecting visitors? I wasn't sure. The note both unnerved and intrigued me, and it awakened in me a compulsion to uncover the truth behind it. That afternoon, I tried to brush off the note as a mere oddity. However, as the sun sank lower in the sky, a series of unsettling occurrences began to unfold. My radio, my only connection to the outside world, started to emit irregular bursts of static. Between the hissing noises, I could just make out fragments of a voice, as if someone were speaking in a language I couldn't quite grasp. I tuned it repeatedly, trying to catch a coherent message, but all I got was distorted sound and eerie whispers. Not long after, I ventured out on a walk to clear my mind. As I trod along a narrow, winding trail, the forest around me seemed to come alive with strange sounds. I thought I heard soft footsteps following me, and occasionally a hushed voice that blended with the rustling leaves. When I glanced back, nothing but the shifting shadows greeted me. My heart pounded in my chest as I quickened my pace, questioning whether my isolation was beginning to play tricks on me. The most unnerving moment came when I encountered another series of markings, this time on a cluster of trees off the main path. Unlike the symbols I'd seen near my RV, these were more chaotic, almost as if they were scrawled hastily in distress. I knelt down, studying them closely, and for a brief moment, I felt as if I were being watched by unseen eyes. The forest, which had offered me solace, now pulsed with an ominous energy that made every sound and movement feel significant. Haunted by these inexplicable events, I decided to learn more about the history of Tishomingo State Park. The next day, I drove to the small ranger station on the outskirts of the park. The station was modest, its walls lined with faded photographs and old documents chronicling decades of park history. I spent hours sifting through local newspapers and archived records. In one yellowed file, I discovered a story about a camper who had mysteriously vanished from the park nearly 30 years ago. The account was murky. A few eyewitness reports of strange lights and unsettling sounds, accompanied by cryptic references to indigenous curses. The more I read, the more a pattern emerged. Locals spoke in hushed tones about that disappearance, treating it as both a cautionary tale and a forbidden subject. I sensed that the note I'd received was not an isolated event, but perhaps a link to this long-ignored tragedy. I returned to my RV with a mind full of questions, and a growing sense that I was about to confront both a local mystery and my own inner demons. As days passed, the isolation of the park began to take its toll. I found myself drifting between moments of deep introspection and bursts of paranoia. I questioned whether the strange noises and symbols were the product of my own fractured mind, worn thin by grief and guilt, or if they were evidence of something truly supernatural. The boundary between reality and hallucination blurred as I wrestled with memories of my past. A past marred by loss and regret that I had long tried to bury. At night, lying in my creaking RV, I would listen to the whispering wind and the soft murmurs that echoed through the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that every sound was a message, every rustle a reminder that my hidden guilt was being mirrored in the haunted woods around me. I felt as if the forest itself was urging me to look deeper, to confront secrets both ancient and personal. One moonless night, with darkness enveloping the park like a shroud, I resolved to follow the trail of clues. The note and the symbols had led me to believe that somewhere deep within the forest lay the remnants of the vanished camper's story, and perhaps the key to my own redemption. Armed with nothing more than a flashlight, a notebook, and a mounting determination to uncover the truth, I set off into the dense woodland. The forest was eerily silent as I ventured further from my RV. My flashlight beam danced over gnarled tree trunks and tangled undergrowth. Every step felt like an intrusion into a sacred space, as if I were trespassing on a secret too long held hidden. After what felt like hours of wandering, I arrived at a secluded clearing. The air here was heavy, almost suffocating, and I immediately sensed that this place was different. In the center of the clearing lay the remains of an abandoned campsite. Rusted metal, broken tools, and a tattered piece of fabric were strewn about. A grim tableau of a life abruptly halted. I knelt down and carefully sifted through the debris, my hands trembling as I uncovered a small leather-bound journal. Its pages were filled with hurried, desperate scrawls describing days of isolation, strange encounters, and the overwhelming loneliness of someone who felt utterly forsaken. The journal belonged to the missing camper. As I read the journal by the faint light of my flashlight, I was struck by the parallels between his words and my own internal struggles. He wrote of voices in the woods, of being followed by shadows, and of an inexplicable sense of being both haunted and hunted. With each page, I felt a growing kinship, a shared loneliness that transcended time. In that moment, I understood that the secrets of Tishomingo were not only about indigenous curses or mysterious disappearances, but also about the deep, unspoken pain that binds us all. No sooner had I finished reading the journal than I felt a presence behind me. I turned sharply, heart hammering in my chest, to see a spectral figure emerging from the darkness. The apparition was of a young woman, her features soft and sorrowful, her eyes filled with a silent plea. She did not speak, yet her expression conveyed a mix of regret and longing. A message too profound for words. I stood frozen, unable to move, as the ghostly figure drifted closer. In her eyes, I saw reflections of my own despair, and in that moment, I realized that her fate was intertwined with the history of this place. The vision lasted only a few heartbeats before she faded into the darkness, leaving me with a deep sense of loss and an even greater urgency to understand what had transpired here. Was she the missing camper? Or perhaps a relative, a victim of circumstances beyond control? The questions multiplied, yet the answers remained frustratingly elusive. I returned to my RV that night, my mind racing and my soul unsettled. The images of the ghost haunted me, merging with memories of my own lost opportunities and regrets. I knew I couldn't remain in this limbo forever. The encounter had forced me to confront not only the mystery of the vanished camper, but also the ghosts of my past. I spent a sleepless night revisiting the journal, trying to decipher the cryptic clues and piecing together the fragments of a story that seemed both ancient and achingly recent. In the pale light of dawn, I made a decision. I had to leave the park with the journal in hand and share this story, not for the sake of sensationalism, but to shed light on the forgotten voices and to begin healing my own shattered heart. I carefully gathered my belongings and left the abandoned campsite, retracing my steps through the forest with a newfound determination. The oppressive atmosphere of the woods felt less like a prison and more like a crucible, one in which painful truths could be forged into a path toward redemption. Back at my RV, I packed up my few possessions and prepared for the journey home. The experience in Tishomingo had changed me irrevocably. I still felt the weight of solitude, yet I also sensed a spark of hope. The possibility that confronting the darkness could lead to a deeper understanding of myself and the world around me. Driving away from Tishomingo State Park, I kept the journal close. Its pages, stained with the despair and determination of someone who had once wandered these same woods, were now a constant reminder that even in isolation, we are never truly alone. The ghostly image of that young woman still lingered in my mind, a silent testament to lives cut short and secrets left to fester in the shadows. I eventually reached home, and over time, I began to share my story with others, attending local gatherings, speaking with historians, and even writing articles about the unexplained phenomena of Tishomingo. My journey was far from over. It was only the beginning of a long process of understanding and healing. The park's secrets remained locked in time, but I had unlocked a part of myself by facing them head-on. Looking back, I realized that Tishomingo was not just a place of natural beauty or eerie legends. It was a mirror reflecting the hidden depths of human sorrow and resilience. The lost camper's journal, the strange symbols on the trees, and the spectral figure I encountered were all pieces of a puzzle that challenged my perception of reality. They forced me to confront the fact that some mysteries cannot be explained away by logic or dismissed as mere hallucinations. Instead, they demand to be acknowledged, embraced, and understood as integral parts of our shared human experience. My name is Michael Donovan, and I carry the scars of that fateful trip with me every day. The isolation of Tishomingo taught me that, while the past is filled with darkness and regret, it also holds the potential for healing if we have the courage to face it. The forest's whispers, the abandoned campsite and the spectral visitor, all of these elements have left an indelible mark on my soul. I learned that redemption does not come from forgetting our pain, but from confronting it, understanding it, and ultimately letting it guide us toward a brighter future. Now, whenever I find myself alone with my thoughts, I recall the haunting nights in Tishomingo. I remember the strange symbols carved into ancient bark, the note that beckoned me to uncover hidden truths, and the soft, sorrowful eyes of the ghost who reached out to me from beyond. I understand now that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, not out of cruelty, but because they serve as constant reminders of the fragile balance between the seen and the unseen, a balance that, once disturbed, can lead us to unexpected revelations about ourselves. As I continue my life, I embrace the lessons learned in that dark forest. I document my journey and share it with those willing to listen, hoping that my experience might offer solace to others grappling with their own inner demons. Tishomingo State Park, with all its ancient secrets and spectral visitors, remains a part of me, a silent guardian of memories, and a testament to the transformative power of confronting the unknown. This is not just a story about a lost camper or a haunted forest. It is the story of my own redemption, forged in the quiet, unforgiving isolation of nature. It is a reminder that even in the depths of solitude, where the past whispers through the trees and the shadows hold unspeakable truths, there is always a path forward, a path illuminated by the faint, unwavering light of hope and self-discovery. And so I drive on, carrying the weight of my past and the promise of tomorrow, forever changed by the secrets of Tishomingo and the relentless pursuit of truth in the face of darkness. My name is Alex Carter. I'm 34 years old, and this is the story of the trip that changed my life forever. It was early autumn in North Mississippi, a time when the forest bursts with vivid colors by day, yet harbors an eerie, unsettling chill by night. I had planned an RV camping adventure along the historic Natchez Trace Parkway, eager to document local legends and capture the haunting beauty of these lands for my blog. I was accompanied by two trusted companions, Jess Monroe, whose logical, detail-oriented mind was a constant counterbalance to my impulsive spirit, and Riley Brooks, whose quiet sensitivity and intuition often hinted at things unseen. We set off in high spirits from Jackson, our RV loaded with supplies, a camera rig, and enough camping gear to last several nights. Our destination was a remote clearing near Tishomingo State Park, a location steeped in indigenous lore and whispered legends of restless spirits. The promise of escaping urban chaos and immersing ourselves in nature's mysteries was irresistible to me, even if Jess remained skeptical and Riley seemed to carry an inexplicable heaviness in their eyes. The first leg of our journey was marred by small setbacks. The RV's heaters sputtered unpredictably, and our GPS system faltered on the winding back roads that crisscrossed the region. I spent an agonizing hour recalibrating our route on a paper map, and the malfunctioning cell service left us isolated from the outside world. Still, we pressed on, our excitement undeterred by these minor inconveniences. That first night, we set up camp in a clearing off the Natchez Trace Parkway. The sunset painted the sky in brilliant hues of orange and crimson, and despite the lingering frustration with our equipment, a sense of wonder filled the air. Around the campfire, Jess meticulously recorded our plan for the coming days, and I casually reviewed my notes on local ghost stories. Riley sat a few paces away, eyes fixed on the dancing flames, as if they sensed something beyond the physical warmth of the fire. It wasn't long before small hints of unease began to punctuate our trip. On our morning hike through the wooded trails near Tishomingo State Park, we discovered strange carvings on the bark of ancient trees. The symbols, reminiscent of Choctaw motifs, were arranged in a pattern that sent a shiver down my spine. "They look like warnings," Jess remarked quietly, tracing one of the lines with a gloved finger. Riley only murmured, "It feels like they're meant for us." Despite our best efforts to dismiss these signs as mere relics of long-forgotten rituals, the feeling of being watched lingered like a dark cloud over our spirits. That evening, as dusk crept in and the temperature dipped, our troubles escalated. I was out collecting extra firewood when I noticed odd footprints circling our RV. They were too large and strangely elongated for any typical animal, and each print seemed to vanish as quickly as it appeared. Returning to camp, I found Jess already examining our surroundings, her rational mind already forming explanations about local wildlife or perhaps the antics of a prankster. Yet, the unexplained footprints and the soft, almost imperceptible whisper of voices carried on the wind left us all unsettled. As darkness settled over the forest, an unsettling silence enveloped our camp. I remember sitting by the fire when a sudden, piercing cry split the night. A cry that was neither animal nor human. The sound echoed off the trees, bouncing back as if the forest itself were mourning. Jess's eyes widened with alarm, and Riley's expression transformed from weary curiosity to raw terror. In that moment, every myth I'd ever written about haunted lands and vengeful spirits took on an all-too-real menace. Over the next few days, tensions among us grew. The RV's failing heater made nights unbearably cold, and our unreliable communication devices left us feeling stranded in a place where the modern world felt entirely out of reach. Jess's rationality clashed with my own eagerness to document every eerie occurrence, and Riley's anxious silence became a constant reminder of the unseen forces at work. The group's unity began to fray as we argued over our next steps. Should we press on, or retreat while we still could? Then came the night that would forever change our lives. We had set up camp in a clearing deep in the forest, far from the well-trodden paths of the Natchez Trace. The moon was a thin crescent in the sky, and the shadows it cast were long and distorted. I was restless, my mind racing with a mixture of excitement and dread. Around midnight, I awoke to the sound of a soft scratching at the RV's door. My heart pounded as I nudged Jess awake. "Did you hear that?" I whispered urgently. Before we could decide what to do, Riley appeared at the doorway, eyes wide and trembling. "There's something out there," they said, voice barely audible. We peered into the darkness, and for a split second I thought I saw a spectral figure standing in the tree line, a form that flickered in and out of view. It had eyes that glowed with an otherworldly intensity, and though I couldn't be sure if it was human or something far more sinister, I knew we were no longer alone. That night, the entity began its relentless haunting. It stalked the perimeter of our camp with an almost deliberate slowness, its presence signaled by sudden drops in temperature and the unmistakable feeling of being watched by malevolent eyes. At first, it simply observed us from a distance, a silent, ghostly figure lurking among the trees. But soon its intentions grew clear. In the dead of night, while I scribbled frantic notes for my blog by the light of a dying battery-powered lantern, a shadow darted past the RV. I barely had time to react before a piercing shriek shattered the silence. I rushed outside to find Riley on the ground, clutching their arm where a deep gash had appeared, as if clawed by unseen talons. Panic surged through me. "Jess! Riley!" I shouted. Scrambling to their side, Jess knelt beside Riley, trying desperately to staunch the bleeding while whispering reassurances that sounded hollow in the face of the inexplicable horror. For that agonizing moment, the forest seemed to come alive with an unseen force, as if the very trees were bearing witness to our terror. The entity had made its first violent move, and it was clear that this was not a mere ghost or wandering spirit. It was a force of nature, dangerous and unpredictable. In the hours that followed, we huddled inside the RV, the once comforting hum of the engine now a feeble guard against the unknown. Jess took charge of our defenses, suggesting that we create makeshift barriers with salt and fire, a tactic drawn from local folklore and old newspaper clippings I had researched before our journey. I couldn't shake the image of that spectral figure with glowing eyes, and every creak of the RV's old frame sent a jolt of fear through my body. Throughout that long, harrowing night, the entity's presence was palpable. It circled the RV like a predator, its silent steps measured and deliberate. At one point I caught a glimpse of it through the grimy window, a shape shifting in the shadows, its form indistinct and constantly in flux. I knew that if we didn't act soon, one of us might not make it to dawn. As the hours dragged on, group tensions reached a boiling point. I argued that we needed to stand our ground and document this encounter, convinced that capturing evidence would not only vindicate our experiences, but also serve as a warning to others. Jess, ever the skeptic, insisted that we retreat and seek help, citing the danger of confronting something we could neither fully understand nor control. Riley, caught between these opposing forces, muttered about the forest's ancient curses and the need to honor the spirits of the land. "I can't just run away," I pleaded, my voice trembling with both fear and determination. "If we don't face this, who will know what really lurks out here?" Jess shot me a sharp look. "And what if your proof is the last thing we ever see?" Riley's soft voice finally cut through the rising tension. Maybe we're meant to understand this. The forest, the carvings, they're not just warnings, they're messages." Before we could decide on a plan, the entity made its move again. In the darkest hour of the night, it burst from the shadows with a ferocity that shattered our temporary calm. I remember the sound, a guttural, inhuman growl that reverberated through the clearing. The creature lunged at the RV, its form now terrifyingly tangible, a grotesque fusion of human and something far beyond. In the ensuing chaos, I saw Jess grab a heavy metal rod from our supply box while I fumbled for my camera, desperate to capture this nightmare. Riley, paralyzed by fear, could only watch as the entity closed in. I swung the rod wildly, managing to knock it aside for a fleeting moment. But it was clear that brute force alone would not save us. The creature's eyes, burning with an unholy light, met mine as if it recognized me. A predator sizing up its prey. In that charged moment, I knew that our survival depended on more than physical strength. It depended on our ability to confront the deep, ancient forces that had been awakened by our intrusion into these sacred lands. Desperation drove us to act. Jess, with her encyclopedic knowledge of local lore, recited incantations and protective prayers gleaned from old records. She scattered salt around the RV, forming a rough circle of protection, while I attempted to document the unfolding terror. Riley, despite their pain and fear, began to trace the strange symbols we had seen carved on trees earlier in the day onto the ground around our makeshift barrier, as if trying to anchor our reality with the very language of the forest. The entity paused, hovering at the edge of our salt circle. For a long, excruciating minute, the silence was deafening. Then, with a sudden, violent lurch, it crashed against the barrier as if testing our defenses. The impact sent shockwaves through the air, and I felt the RV shudder under the force. Jess shouted for us to hold our ground, her voice a mix of authority and desperation. In that chaotic moment, the creature attacked again, this time targeting Riley. I watched in horror as it slashed at them with a force that seemed to tear at the very fabric of their being. The struggle became a desperate battle for survival. I tried to intervene, but in the ensuing melee, the creature's blows were swift and merciless. Blood stained the ground, and the supernatural force seemed to feed on our terror. I could hardly believe that this was happening. This malevolent presence, rooted in the ancient legends of indigenous lore, was not merely a ghost or an apparition. It was a violent force that made no distinction between man and myth. At some point in the frenzy, I lost track of time. Every second was an eternity of fear and adrenaline. My camera, which had once been a tool for capturing beauty and wonder, now lay forgotten as I fought for my life. The creature's attacks were relentless, and despite our frantic efforts to repel it, the line between defense and desperation blurred. In a moment of clarity, I recalled a passage from an old journal I had found in a local library, a record of similar encounters, where survivors had managed to appease the spirit by acknowledging the sacredness of the land. Summoning every ounce of courage, I called out to the entity. "I honor your land," I cried, voice raw and trembling. "I know you protect these sacred places. Please, let us pass in peace." Jess joined in, her tone steady, and even Riley, despite the pain, murmured a hesitant plea for mercy. For a heartbeat, the creature seemed to waver, its form flickering like a candle in the wind. And then, as if in response to our desperate honesty, it retreated, melting back into the darkness from which it had come. The aftermath was a blur of pain, loss, and disbelief. Riley's injuries were severe, and though we managed to drag them back into the RV, the grim reality of our situation had set in. We had come seeking to uncover the truth of North Mississippi's haunted past, and instead we had been forced to confront a horror that defied explanation. Jess, always the pragmatist, quickly tended to Riley's wounds while I tried to piece together what had transpired, my hands still shaking as I held my camera. In the following hours, we debated our next move. Jess was adamant. We needed to leave immediately, to abandon the site before the entity reemerged. I, on the other hand, felt an insatiable urge to document everything, to make sure that the truth of what we had experienced would not be dismissed as mere hysteria. Riley, lying weakly on a makeshift cot inside the RV, could only whisper that the land was speaking to us, that our presence had disturbed something ancient and sacred. The first light of dawn brought little relief. The forest remained silent, as if holding its breath, and the RV's engine groaned in protest when we tried to start it. Our communication devices were still dead, leaving us stranded in a place that felt increasingly like a trap. In the dim morning light, we retraced our steps along the trail, desperate to find a path back to civilization. The carvings we had seen the day before were now covered in dew, their once menacing lines softened but no less mysterious. Every step felt laden with foreboding, the oppressive weight of the forest's history pressing down upon us. I couldn't shake the memory of those glowing eyes, the sound of that unearthly cry, or the primal fear that had surged through me as I fought for our lives. The encounter had left its mark on all of us. Jess's rational mind was shaken to its core, and Riley's quiet sensitivity had evolved into a haunted resignation. By midday, we reached a small, sleepy town on the outskirts of the wilderness. We sought help from the local sheriff, recounting our ordeal with as much detail as our trembling voices would allow. The authorities, steeped in the pragmatism of everyday life, dismissed our account as a product of overactive imaginations stirred by folklore and the isolation of the backwoods. "These parts are known for their legends," the sheriff said, his tone polite but dismissive. "But nothing you described has ever been confirmed." Their indifference only deepened our sense of isolation. We were left with our scars, our memories, and a story that no one would believe. In the quiet aftermath of that fateful night, I sat alone in a cramped motel room, my laptop open to my blog draft. I struggled to capture every detail: the cold metal of the RV's failing heater, the eerie symbols carved into ancient trees, the agonizing moment when our makeshift defenses failed, and the raw terror etched in each of our eyes. I knew that once the full daylight of skepticism returned, our experiences would be relegated to local ghost stories and dismissed as the ramblings of frightened souls. But I couldn't let our truth fade away into obscurity. In the months that followed, I dedicated myself to piecing together every shred of evidence from that harrowing encounter. I scoured local archives, interviewed townsfolk, and revisited the sites where we had confronted the supernatural. Jess, though still cautious and methodical, became more open to the idea that there were mysteries beyond the confines of logic. And Riley, forever changed by that night, withdrew further into themselves, their once vibrant spirit now tinged with a profound sorrow and a deep, unspoken understanding of the land's ancient power. Every time I revisit the logs of that terrifying autumn, I am reminded of the fragile boundary between our world and the realm of the unknown. The entity we encountered was not merely a ghost or an apparition. It was a manifestation of a force that had long guarded these sacred lands. It was dangerous, violent even, yet it was also a tragic echo of an indigenous past that modernity had forgotten. It lurked in the shadows, not out of malice alone, but as a reminder that the ancient ways still held sway over these lands. I still write about that night, about the creeping dread that crept over us as darkness fell, and about the desperate measures we took to appease a force older than any of us. My blog now stands as a testament to the real horrors that can lurk in isolated backwoods. horrors that defy modern understanding and demand a reverence for traditions lost to time. As I type these words, I can still hear the distant echoes of that unholy cry in the depths of my memory, and I know that no matter how far I travel from North Mississippi, a part of me will always remain in that haunted clearing along the Natchez Trace. The forest, with its ancient symbols and relentless shadows, has become an indelible part of my soul. A reminder that sometimes, to confront the darkness outside, we must also confront the darkness within. That trip changed me forever. I learned that survival isn't just about fighting physical threats or overcoming faulty equipment. It's about understanding the forces that shape our world, forces that are as old and mysterious as the land itself. And while I continue to seek out the beauty and wonder of the natural world, I do so with a wary eye on the shadows, knowing that some legends are born of truth, and that in the silence of the wilderness, the ancient guardians are never truly at rest. I still wonder about the entity's final message, if our desperate plea for understanding had been heard, or if we merely disturbed a balance that should never be tampered with. In the end, I can only share my story in hopes that someone, someday, will heed the warnings etched in the trees and carried on the wind. And maybe, just maybe, they will approach the ancient, sacred lands with the respect and humility that might keep the shadows at bay. This is my truth, as raw and painful as it is. The memory of that night, the terror and the loss remain with me every day. And though I have moved on, I know that North Mississippi's dark heart continues to beat in the quiet corners of the forest, waiting for the next soul brave or foolish enough to disturb its eternal slumber. My name is Mason Reed. I'm 42 years old, and this happened in late autumn when I was desperate to escape my past and the unbearable weight of my grief. I had just left behind a life that felt suffocating, driven by memories of loss and regret, and I decided to set out on an RV camping trip deep into the backwoods near Tupelo, Mississippi. I craved solitude, a chance to be alone with my thoughts, with nature, and perhaps with a hint of the old stories whispered among the trees along the Tombigbee River. I remember the day I hit the road all too clearly. The RV I'd inherited from my late uncle was more temperamental than reliable. On the drive out of Jackson, the heater sputtered and groaned, its irregular bursts barely cutting through the chill that had seeped into my bones. My cell service was nearly non-existent, and every bump on the back road reminded me that I was leaving behind not only the city's chaos, but also the familiar comforts of everyday life. I was alone with my memories and the uncertain promise of healing. After hours of navigating dusty highways and winding back roads, I finally arrived at a small clearing by the Tombigbee River. The area was a study in contrasts. Ancient trees reached skyward like silent guardians and relics of history. Weathered stone carvings and remnants of Native American artifacts peeked through the underbrush. The land exuded a quiet dignity, a solemn reminder that life endures even in the face of loss. I set up camp slowly, methodically, as if each movement might dispel the ghosts of my past. My first day was spent exploring the immediate area. I found an old rock with strange carvings that looked almost like warnings. I couldn't help but think that these inscriptions carried secrets of a time long forgotten, a time when the land was alive with the voices of those who had lived here before. I noted every detail in my battered journal, hoping that by understanding the land's history I might begin to understand my own. That first night, as dusk bled into darkness, a fierce autumn storm descended upon the clearing. The wind howled, and rain hammered relentlessly against the RV's thin windows. I sat by a small flickering lamp, trying to read by its weak glow, but my thoughts were too turbulent to focus. The storm outside was both a literal and metaphorical mirror of the turmoil raging inside me. The guilt, the sorrow, and the relentless ache of loss. I spent that night tossing in my bed, the wind's fury outside echoing my internal chaos. In the depths of the storm, I awoke several times, each time convinced that the sound of the wind was whispering secrets, recounting long-forgotten tragedies. I was alone, isolated by nature's wrath and my own memories, until a sudden flash of lightning revealed something unexpected. The silhouette of an abandoned cabin off to one side, half hidden by overgrown brush. I couldn't tell if it was real or a trick of my weary mind, but the image stirred something inside me, a mix of curiosity and trepidation. When the storm finally relented in the early hours of the morning, I ventured out to investigate. The rain had washed the landscape clean, leaving behind a glistening world of damp earth and muted colors. I trudged through the muddy ground toward the cabin, its weathered wood and broken windows suggesting decades of abandonment. Inside, I discovered remnants of lives long past, a rusted lantern, faded photographs, and most intriguingly, a leather-bound journal with yellowed pages. The journal belonged to someone who had traveled these lands many years before, a person whose words spoke of loss, of isolation, and of the healing power of nature. I felt an immediate kinship with this stranger, as though they had understood the same unspoken pain that had driven me into the wilderness. I spent the better part of the day reading the journal, its pages filled with vivid descriptions of grief, hope, and the mysterious messages the land had whispered to its visitors. It wasn't long after that I met Eli. I had been gathering wood near the river when I saw him, a solitary figure leaning against a weathered fence by an old farmhouse, watching me with calm, knowing eyes. He introduced himself in a soft, measured voice. "I am Eli," he said. "I live out here, on the edge of these woods. I've seen many souls come and go, each carrying their own burdens." There was something deeply reassuring about him, a quiet confidence that belied the isolation of his existence. Eli was a local, steeped in the lore of the land, and his presence was like a beacon of gentle wisdom in a place that felt both timeless and haunted. Over the next few days, Eli became my guide in more ways than one. He showed me hidden trails along the Tombigbee River, pointing out ancient carvings on trees and sharing the stories behind them. He explained that the relics and inscriptions I'd noticed weren't merely remnants of the past. They were messages, signs left behind by the people who once honored the sacred cycle of life and death in these lands. "The land remembers, Mason," he told me one crisp morning as we sat by the riverbank. "Every stone, every tree, carries the echoes of those who have been here before. Their voices guide us, if we're willing to listen." Listening, I realized, was exactly what I needed to do. As I began to integrate Eli's words with the insights gleaned from the old journal, I started to see a pattern emerging. A pattern that linked my own grief to the timeless suffering and eventual renewal that the land had witnessed over centuries. The isolation that once felt suffocating began to feel transformative. I started to confront the memories of my lost loved one, to acknowledge the guilt and sorrow that I had long buried beneath layers of numbness. One particular night remains seared in my memory. I had taken refuge in the abandoned cabin during a brief spell of heavy rain. The dim light of a single lantern illuminated the worn wooden floors and peeling walls, and outside, the storm raged on. As I sat there, leafing through the journal, I felt a sudden, overwhelming surge of emotion. The words of the traveler resonated deeply with my own unspoken confessions, and for a long, painful moment I felt as if the past and present had merged into one. Tears streamed down my face as I whispered, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The sound of my voice seemed to awaken the stillness of the cabin. In that raw, vulnerable moment, I sensed that the very spirit of the place was embracing me, urging me to let go of the weight that had held me captive for so long. The next morning, after the storm had subsided, I emerged from the cabin with a newfound determination. I took one last look at the journal. Its pages, now a cherished testament to the struggles and triumphs of those who had walked this path before me, and then set out to return to my RV. Along the way, I encountered Eli once more. He smiled gently when he saw me, as if he already knew that I had crossed a threshold. "The storm has passed, Mason," he said, "both outside and inside you, but remember, healing is not a destination. It's a journey that continues with every step you take." In the days that followed, I busied myself with repairing the RV, a slow, methodical process that gave me time to reflect on my experiences. The engine, which had been temperamental from the start, was coaxed back to life with a few repairs and a lot of hope. I spent long hours under its hood, the steady rhythm of my work mingling with the quiet murmur of the forest. Every so often, I'd pause to take in the landscape. The deep greens of the trees, the shimmering surface of the Tombigbee River, and the distant, timeless monuments that hinted at the stories of the past. Eli continued to visit, always arriving unannounced with a thermos of strong coffee and a few words of encouragement. With him, I began to see that the land was not a silent, indifferent void, but a living tapestry of memory and meaning. The carvings on the rocks and trees, the old inscriptions in the cabin, even the relentless rhythm of the river. All of these were part of a grander narrative, one that spoke of loss and renewal, of the relentless passage of time and the hope that followed in its wake. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and bathed the clearing in a soft golden light, I found myself sitting outside the RV with Eli. We talked about the past, his memories of the land, the old legends that had been passed down through generations, and the ways in which nature could heal even the deepest wounds. I shared with him the journal and my own story of grief and regret, and he listened with a patience that made me feel understood. "You are not the first to feel this way," he said quietly, "and you won't be the last. But every step you take in these woods is a step toward finding the person you were meant to be." In that moment, as the stars began to twinkle overhead and the gentle rustling of leaves became a lullaby for the weary, I felt the first true stirrings of hope. The pain of my past did not vanish instantly, nor did the guilt and sorrow completely dissipate. But there was now a space within me where healing could begin. A space nurtured by the wisdom of the land and the kindness of a stranger who had become a mentor. As my time in the backwoods drew to a close, I knew that I was ready to return to the world I'd left behind. The journey had not erased my grief, but it had given me the tools to face it, to acknowledge the past without being consumed by it, and to move forward with a renewed sense of purpose. On my final morning, I sat in the RV as the early sunlight filtered through the trees, the quiet hum of nature a steady reminder that life, with all its suffering and beauty, continued unabated. Before I left, I made one last stop at the abandoned cabin. I left a note tucked between the pages of the journal, a message for any future traveler who might feel as lost as I once did. I wrote, "May these words remind you that even in isolation, you are never truly alone. The land speaks in whispers. Listen, learn, and let go." It was my way of passing on the gift that Eli in the wilderness had given me, a chance at redemption, a promise of renewal. Driving away along the dusty back roads, I felt the RV's engine steady and strong beneath me, a metaphor for my own slowly healing heart. The journey back to civilization was not as daunting as the one I had undertaken, for I carried within me a newfound resilience and the comforting echo of nature's ancient wisdom. Every mile was a reminder that the scars of the past need not define the future. Even now, months later, I find solace in the quiet moments of reflection. The soft hum of my car on a lonely road, the rustle of leaves in the wind, and the distant murmur of a river that flows through the heart of Mississippi. My time in the backwoods, under the patient guidance of Eli and the silent teachings of the land, transformed my pain into something I can live with, even if it never fully disappears. I've come to understand that healing is a journey, not a destination, and that sometimes the only way to confront our inner demons is to step into the silence of nature and listen. My story is not one of dramatic supernatural terror or sudden epiphanies that banish the darkness in an instant. It is the slow, deliberate process of accepting loss, of understanding that every ending is intertwined with the beginning, and that even the deepest sorrow can yield to the gentle persistence of hope. I left the backwoods with a promise to myself, to honor the past, to cherish the wisdom of those who came before me, and to continue on a path of healing, no matter how winding or uncertain it might be. This journey taught me that in the solitude of nature, every moment is a lesson, and every whisper of the wind is a reminder that I am part of a continuum that spans centuries. The scars of my grief remain, but they are now marks of survival, a testament to the fact that even in isolation, the human spirit can find a way to mend. And as I drive along the open road, I carry with me not only the memory of loss, but also the enduring promise that life, with all its pain and beauty, marches on, quietly, persistently, and always toward the light. I am Mason Reed, 42 years old, and my time in the backwoods near Tupelo changed me forever. The echo of ancient voices, the steady wisdom of nature, and the gentle guidance of a man named Eli helped me confront my inner demons and begin the long, difficult journey toward healing. And as I look back on that autumn, I know that every hardship and every tear shed in solitude was a step toward rediscovering who I was meant to be. My name is Mark. I'm 38 years old, and this happened in the fall of 2023 at Tishomingo State Park, Mississippi. I had spent my childhood exploring these rugged woods, and when the opportunity came to reunite with old friends for an RV getaway, I couldn't resist the lure of familiar trails and long-buried memories. We piled into my aged RV, its engine grumbling in protest as we set off, and headed for Tishomingo. The group was a mismatched collection of personalities. Jill, whose creativity and insatiable curiosity made her our unofficial lore expert. Samantha, whose hyper-awareness of every rustle in the underbrush was both a blessing and a curse. And Tyler, whose irreverent humor masked a deep-seated fear I suspected was waiting to surface. I was determined to lead us safely, but the journey would prove more treacherous than any of us had anticipated. The drive was punctuated by light-hearted banter and nostalgic recollections. However, the RV's equipment began to fail shortly after we entered the outskirts of the park. The generator sputtered erratically, and our GPS, which we'd relied on for directions through the labyrinth of back roads, started sending us off course. At first, we laughed it off, blaming the inevitable quirks of an old vehicle. But as the sun dipped lower and the shadows grew long, the failures of our equipment seemed to echo a more sinister warning. We finally pulled into a secluded clearing near the park's edge. The campsite was overgrown, the trees forming a dense, natural barricade around us. I remember setting up a makeshift perimeter as we unloaded our gear, the chill in the air deepening our unease. Samantha immediately noticed something odd. A series of large, irregular footprints circling our temporary camp. They were too erratic, too unrefined to be made by any normal animal. "Look at these, Mark," Samantha said, her voice trembling slightly as she knelt beside the prints. "They're not human, and not any animal I know." Before I could respond, an inexplicable drop in temperature washed over us. The night air felt as though it had been drained of warmth, and the forest around us seemed to exhale a collective sigh. The trees rustled, though there was no wind to be felt, and a low, mournful sound, a distant wailing, echoed through the darkness. It wasn't long before we experienced our first visual sign of the uncanny. I had been checking on the RV's generator when I caught a glimpse of a figure drifting near a creek just beyond the tree line. There, illuminated briefly by the flickering light of my flashlight, was a woman in a tattered white dress. She moved with a slow, sorrowful grace, disappearing as soon as I blinked. I felt a chill run down my spine, a sensation that this was no ordinary ghost story. The following morning, while we were trying to troubleshoot the RV's unreliable systems, we encountered a park ranger. His weathered face and cautious eyes told stories of his own encounters with the oddities of these woods. Over a cup of lukewarm coffee, he recounted the local legend of the White Lady, a vengeful spirit doomed to wander the park after a tragic death many years ago. According to him, sightings of this ghost had been reported off and on, often accompanied by unexplained phenomena. He also hinted at darker tales whispered among the local indigenous communities, stories of cannibal cults and malevolent guardians who once roamed these lands, exacting brutal retribution on those who dared disturb their sacred grounds. That conversation only deepened our sense of foreboding. Jill, ever the inquisitor, started piecing together what little she could find about these legends, insisting that we needed to take every precaution. Samantha's anxiety grew, every creak of the RV or snap of a twig setting her on edge. Tyler, on the other hand, tried to lighten the mood with humor, though even his jokes began to falter in the face of the mounting dread. As night fell again, the true terror began to manifest. I had organized a watch schedule to ensure that someone was always on alert. Despite our efforts to fortify the RV, the supernatural presence grew more aggressive. At precisely midnight, a violent gust of wind shattered the fragile calm. I heard objects being hurled across the campsite, metal tools clanging against the rocks, and felt an almost tangible force press against the RV, as if something were trying to force its way inside. I joined Samantha on lookout duty, our eyes scanning the dark horizon for any sign of movement. "Do you think it's the White Lady?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Before I could answer, a piercing scream tore through the night. It came from Tyler's direction. Without thinking, I sprinted towards his area, Samantha close behind me. What we found was a scene of chaos. Tyler lay on the ground, his face contorted in pain and terror. His clothes were torn, and there were deep, ragged wounds that spoke of an attack by something brutal and unyielding. It came out of nowhere," he gasped, his voice broken. I saw eyes, burning like fire." His words trailed off into silence as he struggled to breathe. The RV's interior, which we had hoped would serve as our safe haven, had become a battleground against forces we could neither fully understand nor predict. Jill began to piece together the disparate clues, footprints, temperature drops, and ghostly apparitions, and concluded that the entity we faced was not just a restless spirit, but a violent force, perhaps even tied to the ancient cannibal cult legends whispered by local indigenous lore. According to these traditions, the White Lady was not merely a tragic specter, but a harbinger of retribution, a manifestation of centuries-old curses inflicted upon the land by those who once revered its sanctity. We were forced into a grim reality. Survival depended on confronting the supernatural head-on. With the RV compromised and the wilderness closing in, I gathered the remaining members of our group. "We have to understand what we're dealing with," I said firmly, though my voice betrayed the strain of fear and guilt over Tyler's condition. We need to learn everything we can about these legends and find a way to protect ourselves. Jill proposed that we speak with the local Native American elders, whose knowledge of traditional cleansing rituals might offer us a way to appease the malevolent spirit. Samantha, despite her reluctance, agreed, her eyes glistening with a mix of terror and hope. Tyler, though weakened, could only manage a nod of agreement, his earlier levity replaced by grim resignation. Our quest for answers led us deeper into the forest, away from the safety of our RV. We trekked along narrow trails, the dense canopy above filtering the moonlight into eerie, shifting patterns on the forest floor. Every step was laden with trepidation, every rustle of leaves a potential omen. In a clearing, we encountered a weathered stone structure, a remnant of an ancient gathering place used by indigenous peoples. Here, Jill explained, rituals had been performed for centuries. Rituals meant to appease nature's wrath and to keep darker forces at bay. As we prepared to perform a makeshift ritual, guided by Jill's hastily acquired knowledge and Samantha's meticulous notes, tensions among us reached a fever pitch. Marked by desperation and the fear of further loss, our group had to set aside personal grievances and unite in the face of the encroaching horror. I could sense that the spirit we were trying to appease was growing more impatient. The forest itself seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy as shadows danced and the wind carried ghostly whispers. We circled around an ancient oak, its gnarled branches twisted like skeletal fingers against the starless sky. Jill began the ritual, her voice steady yet filled with an undercurrent of urgency. We followed suit, each of us reciting the words that felt both archaic and deeply personal, a bridge between our modern lives and the ancient lore of the land. For a brief, haunting moment, it seemed as if the forest itself listened, every rustle and whisper stilled, and a palpable silence fell over the clearing. Then, the supernatural assault resumed with renewed fury. A violent tremor shook the ground beneath us, and I felt a searing pain as an unseen force struck me. The group scattered, their screams blending with the cacophony of nature turned malevolent. In the ensuing chaos, I lost sight of Jill and Samantha as the forest swallowed us whole. Struggling to regain my bearings, I clutched at consciousness and forced myself to move towards the sound of frantic voices. I stumbled through the underbrush, the cool night air now an oppressive weight against my skin. Every step was a battle against disorientation and dread. When I finally emerged into another clearing, I saw Jill standing by a flickering light, a makeshift lantern, and Samantha crouched beside Tyler, who lay motionless on the ground. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. A deep sense of foreboding tightened my chest as I realized that Tyler's earlier warnings had been more than idle threats. "I'm not leaving him," Samantha murmured, her hands trembling as she tried to staunch a wound on his arm that we hadn't noticed before. The wound, jagged and raw, suggested that whatever had attacked him had not been random. It had purpose and a cruel precision. Tyler's condition worsened by the minute, and the eerie, ghostly presence that had haunted us all seemed to close in around our small, desperate circle. Jill's eyes met mine, and in that moment I knew what needed to be done. "We have to drive him to the hospital," she said, her voice resolute despite the fear that coursed through her. "But the roads out of here—" She hesitated, glancing toward the darkening tree line. "They're not safe anymore." I agreed, and with the little strength I could muster, I helped Samantha lift Tyler into the RV. The journey back was a blur of frantic driving along muddy, unlit roads. The RV's interior was filled with an eerie silence, punctuated only by Tyler's labored breath and the occasional groan from the vehicle itself as it struggled under the strain. I kept one eye on the road and the other on the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that spectral figure in the white dress looming behind us. As dawn crept over the horizon, the nightmare that had engulfed our night slowly began to recede. Tyler's condition stabilized, though he remained in a haze of pain and confusion. We made it to a small town near Tishomingo, where local authorities, initially skeptical, took our account with a mix of pity and wary caution. The park ranger's earlier warnings echoed in my mind, a grim reminder that some things in these woods are best left undisturbed. In the days that followed, while Tyler recovered in the hospital, Jill and Samantha and I tried to piece together the fragments of our experience. The local Native American elders we eventually met spoke of a time when the land was sacred and the forces of nature were balanced by rituals and respect. They recounted how the White Lady was not simply a ghost, but a symbol of the land's anger at the desecration of its traditions, an anger that could manifest violently when provoked by outsiders. That understanding brought little comfort, though it explained the inexplicable. The supernatural presence had been dangerous and violent, not a passive haunting, but an active, almost sentient force. It attacked without warning, as if testing our resolve or punishing us for our intrusion. It was clear now that survival depended not on brute strength or modern technology, but on humility, respect, and an understanding of the ancient powers that still ruled these forgotten places. I spent many sleepless nights reflecting on that fateful journey. I wondered if the RV's failing equipment, the treacherous roads, and our own internal conflicts had been mere coincidences, or if they were somehow intertwined with the malevolent spirit's will. The scars of that night, both physical and emotional, reminded me that the wilderness is a realm where nature and the supernatural coexist in an uneasy, often hostile balance. In the end, our group was forever changed. Tyler, whose joviality had once lightened our darkest moments, would never fully recover from his ordeal, and the memory of his tragic end haunted us all. Jill's relentless curiosity turned to a sober respect for the legends that had once seemed like mere folklore, and Samantha's vigilance became a solemn reminder that every rustle in the dark could be a warning. As for me, I returned to Tishomingo State Park months later, this time alone, driven by a need to confront the past and seek some measure of redemption. I walked the trails where I had once played as a child, the memories of that night mingling with the whispers of the forest. The trees still seemed to hold secrets, and every shadow carried the weight of forgotten tragedies. I left a small token, a prayer of thanks and an apology, at the ancient oak where we had performed the ritual, hoping that somehow the anger of the land might be soothed. That night, as I sat by my campfire, the crackle of burning wood mingled with the soft murmur of the woods. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The temperature dropped suddenly, and for a moment I saw a flash of white, an echo of the woman in the tattered dress. I knew then that the spirit of Tishomingo was not finished with me, with any of us, and that its sorrow and rage were eternal. The wilderness had taught me a bitter lesson, that some legends are born of deep, unhealed wounds, and that the past, however dark, never truly dies. Now, whenever I drive my old RV along those back roads, I do so with a heightened sense of reverence and caution. I carry the memory of that night in every mile, a constant reminder that survival in these parts isn't just about facing the harshness of nature, but also about acknowledging the ancient, sometimes violent spirits that guard the land. And as I navigate the winding trails, I wonder if one day I might finally earn forgiveness for trespassing on a realm that has its own unfathomable history, and for awakening a power that continues to lurk in the shadows of Tishomingo. This story of terror, loss, and reluctant understanding remains etched in my soul, a testament to the unforgiving nature of both humanity and the supernatural. I learned that in the heart of the wilderness, Isolation can reveal not only our deepest fears, but also the fragile ties that bind us to a world much larger and far more mysterious than we ever imagined. My name is Ethan Carter. I'm 42 years old, and this happened in the fall of 2023 when I sought refuge in the remote woods of Pine Hollow near Cleveland, Mississippi. I had reached a point in my life where the constant buzz of the city and the echo of my past mistakes became too much to bear. Desperate for silence and solitude, I decided to take my old RV out into the wilderness, hoping that the isolation would let me confront the guilt that had long haunted me. I had driven for hours along dusty back roads until the landscape opened up to reveal endless stands of ancient pine trees, their silhouettes dark against the twilight sky. The RV, a creaking relic that I had lovingly maintained over the years, rumbled along despite its many mechanical quirks. My hopes for a quiet weekend were quickly dampened by the first sign of trouble. The generator began sputtering unexpectedly, and the GPS insisted on sending me down winding, unmarked trails. Every time I tried to switch channels on the radio for reassurance, static filled the cabin. I pulled off the road near a small clearing that looked promising, a natural spot surrounded by towering pines and a scattering of wildflowers. Setting up camp was a clumsy affair. The RV's hatch wouldn't close properly, and I had to improvise with a few old tarps and some rope. As I hammered a stake into the soft earth, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest, usually a welcome embrace, seemed to hold its breath, as if it were aware of my inner turmoil. That night, after a meager dinner of canned beans heated on a portable stove, I settled into the hard cot inside the RV. The silence outside was profound, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. I tried to sleep, but my mind was restless, replaying memories of the loved one I'd lost and the guilt I carried like a stone in my chest. It was in those dark hours that the first whispers reached my ears, faint, almost indistinguishable murmurs that echoed through the pines. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to make out the words, but they vanished as quickly as they came. The following morning, I ventured out on foot to stretch my legs and clear my head. The dew-laden grass sparkled under the early sun, and for a moment I felt a fleeting sense of calm. As I walked along a narrow trail, I noticed something peculiar. Strange symbols carved into the bark of several trees. They were unlike any natural markings I'd seen, intricate and deliberate, reminiscent of ancient protective sigils. A chill ran down my spine as I recalled a local legend I'd once dismissed as superstition, the tale of the Mirror Witch, a vengeful spirit said to prey upon those burdened by inner demons. I shook off the unease and continued my solitary trek deeper into Pine Hollow. I had hoped that the quiet of nature would soothe my troubled mind, yet the forest seemed to murmur secrets with every step. The further I went, the more the boundaries between reality and my own haunted memories began to blur. I couldn't help but feel as if I were being watched, not by any ordinary creature, but by something that knew my deepest regrets. That afternoon, as I sat by a small stream to rest and refill my water bottle, I caught sight of movement in the corner of my eye. For a split second, I thought I saw a shadow, a figure standing among the trees. But when I turned, nothing was there. I laughed nervously at myself for letting the isolation get to me. After all, I was alone in the wilderness, and any stray shadow was likely nothing more than a trick of the light. Yet, deep down, I sensed that I was not entirely alone. As twilight began to settle, I returned to my RV, intent on fixing the generator so I could at least have some reliable power for the night. With the dim light of a battery-powered lantern, I rummaged through my tools and set to work. The generator's engine coughed and wheezed as I fiddled with its components, and I finally managed to get it running, albeit with an irregular rhythm. No sooner had I secured the last bolt than a sudden gust of wind rattled the RV as if protesting my presence. The air grew inexplicably cold, and I could see my breath misting in the lantern's glow. Inside the RV, I sat on a creaking stool, trying to gather my scattered thoughts. I couldn't shake the sensation that the forest outside was alive with whispers and half-glimpsed movements. In the distance, I thought I heard something that resembled my own voice, distorted and echoing among the pines. I tried to rationalize it as my imagination, fueled by the stress of my troubled past, but a nagging doubt lingered. That night, sleep eluded me once more. The whispering grew louder, and I could now distinguish fragments of words, snatches of regret, sorrow, and something else. Anger? Every time I closed my eyes, images of my past and the face of my lost loved one mingled with the surreal visions of the forest. It was during one of these restless spells that I first encountered the phenomenon that would shatter the fragile boundary between my inner torment and the supernatural reality of Pine Hollow. I awoke with a start to the sound of footsteps outside the RV. My heart hammered in my chest as I peered through the small window. In the pale light of the moon, I could make out a figure, shrouded in darkness, moving slowly among the trees. The figure's outline was disturbingly familiar. It bore an uncanny resemblance to my own silhouette, yet there was an otherworldly quality to its movement, as if it were gliding rather than walking. I blinked hard, convinced that exhaustion was playing tricks on my eyes, but when I looked again, the figure was still there. The realization sent a shiver down my spine. This wasn't a mere hallucination or a trick of the light. It was as if I were facing a doppelganger, a spectral double-born from my own inner demons. My first instinct was to flee, but my feet felt rooted to the spot, and a strange, almost magnetic pull kept me from moving. In a daze, I gathered what little courage I possessed and stepped out of the RV. The chill of the night air was biting, and the forest around me was an endless expanse of shadows and uncertainty. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling despite my attempt at bravado. There was no response, only the soft rustle of leaves and the distant sound of my own heartbeat. I moved slowly toward the direction where I had seen the figure, each step heavy with dread and disbelief. As I neared an ancient stand of pines, the whispering intensified, merging with the soft, almost mournful echo of my own voice. There, in a small clearing, I finally came face to face with what I could only describe as the Mirror Witch. At least, that was what I had come to call this phenomenon. Before me stood my doppelganger, every feature distorted by a spectral glow, its eyes reflecting the pain and sorrow that I had long tried to suppress. The creature, if it could be called that, moved in a way that was both fluid and menacing. It circled me slowly, as if studying my every move, and with each step my heart pounded louder in my ears. I wanted to scream, to run, but I found myself rooted to the spot, caught in a nightmare that was both terrifying and strangely intimate. In that moment, the legends of the Mirror Witch flooded my mind. The local lore described her as an entity that preyed upon the guilt and regret of those who wandered into her domain, using their own inner demons against them. I realized, with a sinking certainty, that the being before me was not a mere figment of my imagination. It was the manifestation of every regret, every sorrow, and every moment of self-reproach I had ever harbored. The air grew thick with an oppressive energy, and the temperature dropped even further as the doppelganger advanced. I could see the anguish in its eyes, a mirror of my own torment, and for a brief moment I felt an overwhelming surge of empathy. But then, as if spurred by some unseen command, it lunged at me. I barely had time to react, stumbling backwards as the spectral figure struck with a force that was both physical and emotional. The impact sent me reeling, and I fell to the ground, the damp earth cold against my skin. For a moment, everything went black, and then the world returned in a distorted, surreal blur. I could hear my own ragged breathing, punctuated by the sound of something else, an unearthly, guttural moan that seemed to emanate from deep within the forest. Struggling to rise, I forced myself to stand, determined not to be defeated by this apparition. I squared my shoulders, trying to channel a courage that felt alien in the face of such overwhelming terror. "I forgive myself," I whispered, the words sounding hollow even as they left my lips. It was a phrase I had repeated in my mind countless times over the years, but never truly believed until now. As if in response, the doppelganger hesitated. Its movements stuttered, and for one agonizing moment the forest fell silent. The oppressive energy that had filled the clearing seemed to pause, waiting for my next move. I took a deep, shuddering breath and continued, "I accept what happened. I will not let my past define me." The words, spoken with desperate conviction, rippled through the still air. The doppelganger's form wavered, as though the very essence of its being was destabilized by my admission. I watched in awe and terror as the spectral figure began to dissolve, its edges blurring into the darkness. The forest, which had been a stage for our brutal confrontation, now seemed to exhale a long-held breath. For what felt like an eternity, I stood there alone in the clearing, the only sound my own heartbeat gradually returning to a steady rhythm. Slowly, the oppressive chill receded, replaced by a tentative warmth that spread through my body. I realized that in forgiving myself, I had broken the hold that the mirror witch had on me. A realization that was as liberating as it was painful. The journey back to my RV was a blur of exhaustion and introspection. Every step I took felt like a deliberate act of defiance against the ghosts of my past. The forest, though still filled with shadows, no longer felt hostile. The strange symbols on the trees and the once menacing whispers seemed to fade into the background, replaced by a quiet acceptance of the natural world and my place within it. Back at the RV, I sat in silence for hours, my thoughts a tangled mix of relief, sorrow, and a newfound understanding. I knew that the encounter with my doppelganger, the manifestation of my guilt and regret, had been more than a mere supernatural event. It was a confrontation with the deepest parts of myself. The mirror witch had not come to kill me, but to force me to face the inner turmoil that had held me captive for so long. In the days that followed, I remained in Pine Hollow, not as a frightened wanderer, but as someone determined to reclaim his life. I spent long hours wandering the forest, speaking softly to the trees as if they were old friends. I revisited the clearing where I had encountered the doppelganger and left behind a small token, a simple carved wooden charm, a symbol of forgiveness and rebirth. In that quiet moment, I felt a connection to the ancient land, as if the very soul of the forest had accepted me for who I was, scars and all. The nights, though still touched by an eerie silence, no longer brought the same terror. I began to notice that the whispers had transformed from accusatory echoes of my guilt into gentle reminders that healing was possible. The symbols on the trees, once ominous and foreboding, now took on the appearance of sacred marks, testaments to a long-forgotten ritual of protection rather than a curse. Every now and then, as I drove my old RV along the winding back roads of Pine Hollow, I would catch a fleeting glimpse of a shadow in the rearview mirror, a subtle reminder of the Mirror Witch's presence. But it was no longer a harbinger of doom. Rather, it served as a quiet affirmation that my journey towards redemption was ongoing, and that every step forward was a victory over the darkness that had once threatened to consume me. Reflecting on that surreal week in the wilderness, I came to understand that the true enemy was not some external malevolence, but the inner demons we all carry. The forest, with its ancient pines and whispered legends, had become a crucible for my own transformation. In the face of the supernatural, I was forced to confront the parts of myself that I had long denied. And though the scars of that encounter remain etched in my memory, they are now symbols of survival and rebirth, a reminder that even in the depths of isolation and despair, there is a path to healing. I eventually left Pine Hollow with a quieter mind and a renewed spirit, but I know that the echoes of that place will always linger within me. The Mirror Witch, or perhaps the reflection of my own inner darkness, had taught me a lesson I will never forget. Redemption is not found by running away, but by facing the truth of who we are, no matter how painful it might be. Now, as I travel the highways in my creaking RV, I carry that lesson with me. I speak little of the horrors I experienced in Pine Hollow, but in quiet moments, when the road is empty and the night is deep, I sometimes hear a faint, gentle whisper in the rustling leaves, a soft reminder that the past can be forgiven, and that every new day is a chance to begin again. My name is Adam Carter. I'm 32 years old, and this happened in the fall of 2023. I'd always believed that the backwoods of northern Mississippi held secrets best left undisturbed, but nothing could have prepared me for the journey that would change my life forever. My friends, Brooke Ellis, Chris Mendoza, and Dana Lee, had longed for a break from our hectic lives in Tupelo. We craved a weekend away from the modern world, a chance to reconnect with nature and with each other. The destination we chose was Blackberry Creek, a narrow, twisting waterway near Holly Springs, shrouded in the dense forests and murky legends of the region. We'd heard whispers of old indigenous curses and tragic histories, but we were drawn by the promise of unspoiled wilderness and adventure. The RV we rented was a beat-up model, more rust than metal, and it showed its age from the moment we hit the road. I was the one who'd insisted on renting it. After all, I prided myself on being resourceful and mechanically inclined, but even I couldn't fix the sputtering engine that choked and coughed on a lonely stretch of highway. Stranded for a few hours in a barren field, we were forced to share a cramped space, our cell phones dead in the middle of nowhere, and our nerves fraying under the weight of isolation. Brooke, ever the empath, sensed the undercurrent of dread before any of us could name it. "It's like the woods are watching us," she murmured, as we waited for a tow truck that seemed as reluctant as our situation. I tried to reassure her with practical observations, but even I felt a prickle of unease when the wind whispered secrets through the trees. Once the RV was patched up and we finally hit the road again, our tensions simmered just beneath the surface. Chris, always the thrill-seeker, joked about our misfortune and dared us to explore the roadside trails. Dana, quiet and introspective, kept to herself most of the time, her eyes darting nervously to every shadow. I knew that our differing worldviews, my reliance on logic clashing with Brooke's intuition, Chris's audacity, and Dana's caution, would soon be tested by the events to come. That first night at Blackberry Creek, we set up camp near a clearing by the water. The creek ran swift and cold, its banks dotted with ancient oaks that seemed to lean in closer as if listening. I remember the silence that fell over us after dinner. It was heavy, punctuated only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of an unseen animal. As darkness deepened, an unsettling stillness crept in, and I found myself glancing nervously at the tree line. It started with small things. A misplaced can of coffee here, a moved cushion there. At first, I assumed we were all just on edge after the breakdown and the long drive. But then came the whispers. While I was checking the rig near the engine, I heard a low murmur, like someone, or something, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I froze, straining my ears, and only the sound of my own heartbeat answered back. Brooke was the first to voice her concern. "Adam, did you hear that?" she asked quietly as we huddled inside the RV. It sounded like someone crying. I shrugged it off as the wind, but inside a seed of worry had been planted. The real terror began when Dana, who had been sitting by the window, screamed softly and pointed toward Blackberry Creek. Through the glass I saw a pale figure, a woman dressed in tattered, indigenous-style garments, standing motionless on the bank. Her eyes were voids of sorrow, and for a split second our world seemed to tilt off its axis. Chris laughed nervously, insisting it was just a trick of the light, but his voice wavered with uncertainty. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had intruded on a sacred, forbidden place. The local lore, passed down through generations of Native Americans and whispered among the modern-day locals, spoke of a vengeful spirit, a guardian of the land who had once been wronged by colonizers. Over time, her spirit had twisted into something dark and malevolent, punishing those who dared disturb her domain. The next morning, as dawn broke with a pale, reluctant light, our RV's engine rumbled to life. We decided to explore the area on foot, partly to stretch our legs and partly to get away from the oppressive atmosphere of the vehicle. The forest around Blackberry Creek was as enchanting as it was eerie. The air was cool and damp, and the trees, draped in Spanish moss, created a labyrinth of shadow and light. While Chris led the way down a narrow, overgrown trail, Dana trailed behind, her eyes fixed on the ground. Brooke walked close to me, her presence both comforting and unnerving as she whispered about the feeling of unseen eyes watching us. Every so often, I felt a prickle on the back of my neck, a warning that we were not alone. It wasn't long before our unease turned to genuine dread. In a clearing, we found strange carvings on the trees, symbols that looked both ancient and disturbingly familiar. I recognized them from a book I'd once read about indigenous rights. They were markings of sorrow, of deep pain and loss. "This isn't just vandalism," I muttered. "These are ritual symbols." Chris, ever the skeptic, scoffed. "You're reading too much into it, Adam. It's just some old carvings." But even he couldn't hide the uncertainty in his eyes. Brooke, however, was visibly shaken. "I've heard that these markings are meant to summon the spirit, an angry guardian of the land," she said, her voice trembling. That night, as we returned to the RV, the supernatural occurrences escalated. Windows shattered without a discernible cause, and a force seemed to slam the doors shut with such violent force that I thought the RV would collapse. In the chaos, Chris was nearly thrown against the wall. The relentless pounding and the sudden gusts of frigid wind left us breathless and terrified. Inside, our group dynamics began to fracture. I found myself caught between rationality and the palpable dread that was infecting our group. I tried to calm everyone, insisting we remain logical and figure out a plan. But Brooke's intuitive insistence that we needed to honor the spirit's memory clashed with Chris's demand to simply flee, and Dana's escalating panic made every decision feel fraught with peril. As the nights wore on, the hauntings grew more violent. The spirit of the pale woman returned time and again, her appearances becoming more frequent and her manifestations more aggressive. At one point, as I lay in the darkness trying to ignore the sounds of the wind, I felt a cold hand brush against my cheek. I bolted upright, my heart hammering, only to see nothing but the murky interior of the RV. It was then I realized that this entity wasn't just a passive presence. It was actively trying to communicate or perhaps punish us. The turning point came on the third night. Chris, ever the foolhardy adventurer, insisted on exploring the dense part of the woods alone. Against my better judgment and the protests of Dana, he set off with a flashlight and a sense of bravado that I now understood to be masking deep-seated fear. We waited, time stretching into an agonizing silence, until eventually Brooke and Dana decided to search for him. I reluctantly joined them, my instincts screaming that this was a terrible idea. We found Chris near a stream, his flashlight flickering wildly as he muttered incoherently. He described an encounter with something that had lunged at him, a dark, amorphous shape that moved with supernatural speed. "It wasn't human," he whispered, his voice shaking. It was like it was made of the night itself. His story was interrupted by a sudden violent noise in the distance, a scream that none of us could quite place as human or otherwise. That was when we decided we couldn't simply run away. We had to confront the darkness head-on. We sought out a local spiritual guide, a man named Elijah, an elderly native storyteller known in the community for his deep knowledge of the land and its old ways. Elijah met us in a small town just outside Holly Springs, his eyes grave and filled with the weight of unspoken history. He listened intently as we recounted our experiences, nodding slowly as if he'd expected this all along. "Elijah," I began, my voice barely concealing my desperation. "What have we done? We've disturbed something ancient and vengeful." Elijah's response was measured and filled with sorrow. "The spirit you've encountered is that of Naya, once a guardian of this land, wronged beyond measure. In her grief, she has become a force of retribution. You must show her respect and seek forgiveness for the trespasses of those who came before." He explained that the only way to appease Naya's wrath was to perform a ritual, a ceremony that acknowledged the historical wrongs inflicted upon her people. The ritual would demand unity, humility, and a willingness to confront not only the supernatural terror that plagued us, but also the human failings that had brought us to this point. Reluctantly, we agreed. The night of the ritual was the most harrowing of our entire ordeal. Under a sky shrouded in oppressive clouds, we gathered at a clearing Elijah had chosen. A site marked by ancient carvings and a sense of profound sadness. He instructed us to form a circle around a small makeshift altar where we placed offerings, items that had belonged to the local indigenous people, tokens of their lost heritage, and symbols of our own remorse for the ignorance of the past. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, the cold night air biting at my skin. "My name is Adam Carter. I'm 32, I began, my voice echoing in the quiet. "I confess that we have come here unaware, blind to the pain of those who came before us. I ask for forgiveness on behalf of all who have trodden this sacred ground." One by one, Brooke, Chris, and Dana echoed their confessions, their voices merging with the sound of the wind, a wind that now seemed to carry a note of sorrow, as if Naya herself was listening. As the ritual progressed, the atmosphere grew charged with an electric intensity. The forest around us responded. The wind howled, the trees creaked, and the very ground trembled. For a moment, it felt as if time itself had paused, holding its breath in anticipation of what would come next. And then, as if answering our collective plea, a spectral figure emerged from the darkness. A pale, sorrowful apparition of Naya. Her eyes were deep pools of grief, and for a heartbeat all of us felt the crushing weight of centuries of injustice. Her presence was not immediately violent, but there was an undeniable menace in the way the air seemed to ripple around her. Then, without warning, the entity lashed out. A burst of supernatural force shattered a nearby tree, sending splinters of wood flying in every direction. Chris was caught in the shockwave, and I rushed to his side as he crumpled to the ground. His face was contorted in pain, and, for a brief moment, I feared that the spirit's wrath had claimed another victim. "Hold on, Chris," I pleaded, pressing my hands to his side as Brooke and Dana knelt beside him. In that moment of chaos, our differences faded, and all that remained was the desperate need to survive. We clung to each other as the supernatural fury raged around us, a dark, unrelenting storm of wind, pain, and otherworldly energy. Elijah's voice rose above the turmoil, steady and commanding. "This is the price of reckoning," he intoned. "Let her pain be our lesson, and let our unity be our strength." His words lent us a fragile hope, a belief that, perhaps, through our collective remorse and understanding, we might temper the spirit's wrath. The ensuing moments blurred into a cacophony of screams, clattering debris, and the sound of our frantic hearts. In the midst of it all, I found myself face to face with Naya. Her gaze, filled with both sorrow and fury, locked onto mine. I saw in her eyes the endless grief of a people long forgotten, and in that gaze, I understood that our survival depended not solely on our physical escape, but on our willingness to confront and reconcile with the darkness of our shared history. Time seemed to stretch on infinitely until, gradually, the violent manifestations subsided. The forest's cacophony diminished into a mournful whisper, and the spirit receded into the shadows, leaving us battered, injured, and forever changed. Chris, though alive, bore deep wounds, a testament to the spirit's lethal power. Dana's eyes, once filled with quiet apprehension, now shone with a mix of terror and a strange newfound resolve. Brooke, ever the intuitive soul, appeared more contemplative than frightened, as if she had glimpsed a truth far greater than any of us had anticipated. In the aftermath of that fateful night, we remained at Blackberry Creek for several more days, nursing our wounds and processing the unearthly events that had unfolded. We eventually left the backwoods, our RV chugging along the long road back to civilization, carrying with us scars that would never fully heal. The experience at Blackberry Creek was a brutal reminder that some forces are ancient and inexorable, their origins rooted in the collective memory of a land marked by sorrow and injustice. Now, whenever I return to the quiet moments of my life, I find myself haunted by memories of that autumn night. The spectral eyes of Naya, the relentless roar of the wind, and the desperate unity of a group pushed to the brink of despair, all remain etched into my soul. I learned that survival isn't merely a matter of physical endurance. It's about facing the darkest parts of our history and our nature. And sometimes the only way to move forward is to confront the ghosts of the past, both human and supernatural, with humility, courage, and an unwavering commitment to change. As I write these words, I know that my life will never be the same. The wilderness of northern Mississippi, with its rugged trails and whispered legends, taught me that every place has its story, and every spirit its sorrow. I now carry that understanding with me, a constant reminder that in the heart of darkness, our shared humanity is both our greatest weakness and our strongest shield. The ordeal at Blackberry Creek remains a testament to the power of the past, a chilling reminder that nature, history, and the supernatural are intricately entwined, waiting patiently for those who dare to disturb them. And as I continue on my journey, I do so with a profound respect for the mysteries of the world, forever mindful of the thin veil that separates the known from the unknown. My name is Jared Thompson. I'm 47 years old, and this happened in the winter of 2022. I was desperate to escape the constant reminders of my past, so I set out in my battered old RV toward Pine Hollow Campground along the banks of the Blackwater River in Tishomingo County, Mississippi. I needed solitude, a place where the only voices were the wind in the trees and the gentle murmur of the river, to finally confront the grief that had tormented me ever since the day I lost my wife. I'd spent years burying my sorrow beneath layers of routine and distraction. The loss of Marianne had shattered me in ways I could never fully articulate, leaving behind an ache that no amount of busy work or transient relationships could soothe. In search of solace, I traded the relentless noise of city life for the oppressive quiet of the backwoods. I hoped that in isolation, among ancient pines and whispering breezes, I might find a way to forgive myself. The RV I rented was as worn out as my soul. A rusted hulk with flickering lights, a temperamental heater, and a persistent series of minor breakdowns. It was a stark reminder of how life, like this machine, can sometimes sputter along, barely holding together. I wasn't overly concerned about the mechanical failings. They were simply part of the journey. Instead, I focused on the destination, Pine Hollow Campground, a secluded retreat that promised both the beauty and the haunting melancholy of nature unspoiled by modernity. When I arrived at Pine Hollow, the first thing that struck me was the eerie quiet that enveloped the area. The campground lay nestled in a small clearing by the Blackwater River, its banks shrouded by dense clusters of pines and cypresses. Spanish moss draped from the branches like ghostly tresses, and the persistent drizzle that had begun as I drove in only added to the desolate beauty. I set up camp as best as I could, feeling simultaneously relieved and unnerved by the isolation. That first night, as I sat outside the RV watching the rain splatter on the roof, I couldn't shake a strange feeling, a sense of being observed by something unseen. The wind seemed to carry a soft, almost childlike laughter that echoed faintly between the trees. I tried to dismiss it as my imagination, fueled by loneliness and the relentless tapping of raindrops, but the sound persisted. It wasn't long before I noticed that small personal items, tokens of Marianne that I had tucked away for comfort, were not where I remembered leaving them. A keepsake locket and a faded photograph had inexplicably been moved, as if handled by a pair of unseen hands. I went to bed that night with a gnawing unease. In my dreams, Marianne's face appeared, not with the warmth of memory, but in a pained, almost pleading expression. I awoke drenched in sweat, the echoes of soft footsteps lingering in the darkness outside the RV. I tried to tell myself that it was just grief, a mind trick playing with my deepest insecurities, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The following day, I decided to explore the grounds in an effort to distract myself and perhaps gather my scattered thoughts. I set out along a narrow trail that led into a thicket of trees bordering the campground. The overcast sky did little to lift my spirits. The chill in the air seeped into my bones, amplifying my inner desolation. I couldn't help but notice primitive carvings etched into the bark of several trees, symbols that seemed both ancient and sorrowful, as if they were memorials to forgotten tragedies. I recalled a passage from an old history book about the indigenous people who had once roamed these lands, their lives marked by both beauty and unspeakable loss. The markings filled me with a somber respect and a creeping fear of disturbing secrets long held by the earth. As dusk approached, the sense of unease deepened. I returned to the RV only to find that the soft murmur of distant laughter had grown louder. It wasn't merely the wind. It was as if the forest itself was trying to speak. I stepped outside and strained my ears. There, at the edge of the clearing, I caught a glimpse of movement. a small figure darting between the trees. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. For an instant, I thought I saw the spectral image of a child, small, pale, and sorrowful, standing motionless as if waiting for something. The figure vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving me trembling in the cold night air. I hurried back to the RV and locked the door, trying to convince myself that my grief was conjuring phantoms. But deep down, I sensed that the apparition was real. A silent messenger born of tragedy, meant to force me to confront something I had long ignored. Over the next few days, the oddities only grew. On several occasions, I would find objects rearranged inside the RV. The locket that I had kept on a small shelf would be in a different place, and sometimes, faint footprints would appear on the damp floor around my sleeping area. I tried to document these occurrences in a journal, but even as I wrote, the lines between reality and hallucination blurred. My dreams were invaded by the same child, whose face was etched with a sorrow that I recognized as ancient. In one recurring vision, I saw the child standing before a weathered stone shrine deep in the woods, a shrine adorned with primitive symbols that told a story of loss and remembrance. One stormy night, the tension reached its peak. The rain lashed the RV and the wind howled like a chorus of lost souls. I awoke to the sound of the door creaking open. My first instinct was to reach for the old revolver I kept for emergencies, but I paused, unsure if this was the moment to confront whatever terror lay beyond the thin walls of my temporary refuge. Instead, I crept to the window and peered out into the darkness. The child was there again, its eyes glistening with an otherworldly light, beckoning me silently from the gloom of the forest. Compelled by a force I couldn't quite understand, I wrapped myself in a thick jacket and stepped out into the storm. The rain was blinding, and the wind nearly knocked me off balance as I followed the faint glow of the child. Every step I took was laden with trepidation, but an inexplicable pull urged me onward, deeper into the forest. The path was barely visible beneath the torrent, and the dense canopy overhead only added to the oppressive darkness. After what felt like hours, I reached a small clearing illuminated sporadically by flashes of lightning. In the center stood a weathered stone shrine, half consumed by moss and time. The shrine was adorned with primitive carvings, symbols that resonated with the sorrow of generations long past. It was there that I understood. The ghostly child was not an isolated apparition, but a fragment of a deeper, more profound tragedy that had befallen these lands. As I stood before the shrine, memories, both my own and those I could only imagine, flooded my mind. I recalled stories of a small community lost to a mysterious illness, children who vanished without a trace, and the lingering grief of those left behind. I realized that the ghost was a remnant of this forgotten sorrow, a symbol of the pain and loss that had seeped into the very soil of Pine Hollow. In that moment, the raw power of nature and history converged. I fell to my knees, overwhelmed by a mixture of grief and a strange sense of connection. I spoke aloud, not to the ghost, but to Mary Ann, to all the lost souls whose voices had been silenced by time and neglect. "I'm sorry," I whispered into the roaring wind. "I'm so sorry for the things we never could undo." The act of speaking, of acknowledging the deep-seated pain that had haunted this place, felt like a first step toward forgiveness, a fragile hope that healing might be possible even for the most broken of hearts. As I knelt there, the storm began to recede, and with it, the oppressive weight of isolation that had cloaked my soul for so long. The spectral child lingered nearby, its presence less demanding now, as if it had found a measure of peace in my act of contrition. I felt that by facing the past, both my own and that of these forgotten people, I was beginning to mend the shattered fragments of my life. In the days that followed, the supernatural occurrences at Pine Hollow became less frequent, though the memories of that night continued to haunt me. The RV, despite its mechanical shortcomings, remained my steadfast companion as I slowly prepared to leave the campground. I spent long hours by the Blackwater River, watching its steady, unchanging flow and reflecting on the profound lessons I had learned. The spectral visitations, the eerie rearrangements of my possessions, and the sorrowful gaze of the ghostly child had all been catalysts for confronting my deepest guilt, a burden I had carried since Marianne's passing. I left Pine Hollow Campground with a cautious optimism. The isolation had forced me to face the specters of my past, and while the wounds of grief would not vanish overnight, I had taken the first steps toward healing. The child's ghost, which had seemed so insistent and desperate at first, now appeared only in fleeting moments. A silent reminder of loss, yes, but also of the possibility of redemption. I kept a small token from the shrine, a smooth, weathered stone etched with one of the symbols, as a reminder of that night and the promise of forgiveness. Driving back along the lonely roads of northern Mississippi, I felt a subtle change within me. The incessant, paralyzing sorrow that had once threatened to consume me had softened into a quiet resolve. I understood now that survival was not just about enduring external hardships or mechanical failures. It was about confronting the internal demons that haunted us. The ghostly apparitions of Pine Hollow had been less a curse than a call to acknowledge the past, to honor the lost, and to grant myself permission to move forward. Even now, as I write these memories in the solitude of my modest apartment, I feel the presence of Pine Hollow in the quiet moments. When the wind whistles through a narrow alley, or when a soft, distant sound reminds me of the rain on that fateful night. I know that I will never forget the lessons I learned in that secluded corner of Mississippi, where nature, history, and the supernatural converged to offer me a chance at redemption. My journey continues, and though the road ahead is uncertain, I carry with me the understanding that the pain of loss does not have to be an endless burden. It can be transformed into a stepping stone toward forgiveness, a quiet promise that even in our darkest moments, healing is possible. And perhaps, somewhere deep in the backwoods, the ghost of a small child still watches over those who dare to face their past, reminding us that every end is the beginning of a new, fragile hope. Looking back, I see Pine Hollow not as a place of terror, but as a crucible of transformation. It was there, amid the spectral whispers and the relentless drizzle, that I learned the profound truth about solitude. That in our isolation we can sometimes hear the voices of our deepest regrets, and if we have the courage to listen, they might just guide us to a path of healing. My name is Julian. I'm 45 years old, and this happened in the winter of 2022. I left behind a life filled with regret and the constant hum of a city that no longer felt like home. With an aging RV as my only companion, I set off into the deep heart of Bienville National Forest, North Appalachian, Mississippi, seeking solitude and hoping that isolation might help me piece together the shattered fragments of my past. The RV, battered and creaky, had been my refuge for the past few months. Its worn upholstery and persistent mechanical quirks were a constant reminder of my own brokenness. I'd chosen Bienville because I'd heard that the forest silence had a way of forcing a man to confront himself. As I drove along unpaved winding back roads, the dense canopy of towering pines closed in around me. The further I went from civilization, the louder my inner demons began to whisper. I wasn't entirely sure if I was escaping or simply running toward something inevitable. The first day was a haze of repairs and self-reassurance. The engine coughed, the heater malfunctioned, and the RV's electrical system played its own cruel game by flickering in the chill evening air. I set up camp on the flat clearing that felt almost too isolated. There, in the quiet of the forest, the weight of my past pressed in with every creaking branch and rustling leaf. So I spent that first night listening to the natural orchestra of the woods, trying to drown out the echoes of guilt and regret that had haunted me for years. It wasn't long after sundown that the strange began to happen. I was sitting on a rickety stool outside the RV, watching the fog roll in as twilight deepened. I noticed something odd in the reflection of the RV's side mirror. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow, perhaps, thrown by the swaying trees. But when I turned, I saw nothing but the endless rows of black silhouettes. Yet, as I looked back, there it was again. A figure that mirrored every movement I made. My heart pounded, and I chalked it up to fatigue and an overactive imagination. Over the next few days, the forest seemed to conspire with my inner turmoil. At dawn, I discovered strange symbols carved deep into the bark of an ancient oak near my campsite. The markings were deliberate, almost ritualistic, and reminded me of the Native American legends that spoke of spirits reflecting one's inner darkness. At dusk, I heard footsteps in the soft soil circling the RV and sometimes even caught my own whispered voice carried by an unseen wind. The isolation of Vengeful was no longer just physical, it was deeply psychological. I began to wonder if my past was manifesting in a form that I couldn't escape. One particularly foggy evening, while trying to coax warmth from a malfunctioning heater, I caught sight of the figure again. This time, it appeared in a window reflection. A dark, silent doppelganger, standing just behind me. I froze, unable to tear my eyes away from the spectral mirror image. It was as if the creature was studying me, its eyes a void of malice and sorrow. I convinced myself it was my own guilt made tangible, a trick of the light born from a shattered mind. But deep down, I knew that something more was at work. As nights passed, the presence grew bolder. My sleep was plagued by nightmares of endless, fog-shrouded roads and a relentless, echoing voice that repeated my most damning mistakes. I would wake up drenched in sweat, the room dark and silent, but the chill of that unseen presence clung to me like a second skin. I started to record my thoughts in a tattered journal, trying to distinguish between the supernatural and the echoes of my troubled mind. The turning point came one bitterly cold night when the full moon hung low and pale in the sky. I decided to take a walk around the perimeter of the RV, hoping that the fresh air would clear my head. The moonlight filtered through the mist, casting elongated shadows on the forest floor. It was then that I heard my name, soft, almost indistinguishable from the wind. I stopped dead in my tracks. The sound was too deliberate, too human. Then I saw it, a flicker of movement among the trees. I bolted toward the sound, the darkness and fog transforming the forest into a labyrinth of uncertainty. My footsteps were muffled by the damp earth as I came upon a clearing that housed an abandoned trailer. Its windows were dark and its door swung open, creaking in the night breeze. Standing just inside, illuminated by the faint glow of the moon, was the doppelganger. It wore an expression that was part malice, part unbearable sorrow, a reflection of every hidden guilt I had ever tried to bury. The figure began to move, slowly, deliberately. I felt my blood turn to ice as it stepped forward, its form wavering as though it were made of mist. The doppelganger raised a hand, and I noticed that the symbols I'd seen on the trees were etched faintly into its skin. It spoke without words, a wave of overwhelming emotion that washed over me in a torrent of despair, regret, and an unquenchable anger. I staggered backward, heart hammering, as my mind teetered on the brink of complete collapse. I knew then that the apparition was not merely a figment of my imagination. This was the embodiment of everything I had been running from. The dark shadow of my inner self made real by the haunted woods of Vengeful. The presence seemed intent on dragging me into an abyss of self-loathing, and I could feel its force trying to pull me over the edge, both emotionally and physically. In that moment, standing in the ghostly glow of the abandoned trailer, I realized that if I did not confront this manifestation of my guilt, it would consume me entirely. I retreated hastily back to the RV, my body trembling, mind reeling. The next day, I spent hours poring over local lore and old legends preserved in a faded notebook I had found tucked away in a dusty roadside diner before entering the forest. I learned that the indigenous people of this region believed in spirit doubles, manifestations of a person's inner turmoil that, when left unchecked, could take on a life of their own. According to these stories, such entities were not evil in the conventional sense, but were dangerous because they represented the unacknowledged dark parts of one's soul. In my case, my unresolved guilt and shame had somehow given birth to this malevolent reflection. Desperation clawed at me, and I resolved to face my inner demon head-on. I gathered every ounce of courage I had left and decided to venture into a nearby ghost town, a relic of a once thriving community now swallowed by time and neglect. Rumors said that the ghost town, with its crumbling buildings and silent streets, was a place where many came to confront the shadows of their past. My RV limped along the deserted road until I reached the outskirts of the town. The silence was oppressive, each step echoing on the broken pavement as I navigated through deserted storefronts and homes that stood as somber monuments to lives long forgotten. In the center of the ghost town, I found an abandoned building that had once served as a community hall. Its walls, covered in peeling paint and faded graffiti, seemed to hum with the energy of untold stories. Inside, the air was thick with dust and memories. I sat on a cold wooden bench and allowed myself to reflect on every mistake, every regret, every moment that had led me to this confrontation with myself. As midnight approached, the doppelganger appeared again. This time, it was unmistakably clear. A solid figure standing at the far end of the hall, its eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that pierced through the layers of my defenses. I could feel the weight of its presence, a force that threatened to unmoor me from reality. With trembling hands, I pulled out my journal and began to write, confessing every secret, every regret, every burden I had carried for far too long. The act of writing, of acknowledging my failures, felt like an offering, a desperate bid for redemption. For what felt like hours, I poured my soul onto paper. The words, raw and unfiltered, echoed in the hollow room. As I finished, I looked up, and the doppelganger was gone. In its place, a silence so profound filled the space that it seemed to cradle my very being. I realized that by facing my darkest emotions head-on, I had taken the first step toward reclaiming control over them. The apparition had been both a warning and a guide, a manifestation of the internal struggle I needed to overcome. In the days that followed, I remained in the ghost town, determined to complete the work I had begun. I ventured into the surrounding forest and returned to the spot where I'd first seen the carvings on the oak. There, I performed a ritual of sorts, simple, unadorned, and deeply personal. I carved my initials next to the ancient symbols, not as a mark of permanence, but as a testament to my willingness to confront and accept my past. With every stroke, I felt a part of the heavy burden I'd carried for so long begin to lift. The supernatural encounters did not vanish overnight. The doppelganger still appeared in fleeting moments. A glimpse in a shattered mirror, a shadow moving in the corner of my eye, but its presence was no longer paralyzing. Instead, it served as a constant reminder of the work that still lay ahead. I repaired my RV bit by bit, mirroring the slow but steady process of internal healing. Every malfunction I fixed, every creak I silenced, became a metaphor for the mending of my fractured soul. One morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the dense canopy, I stood outside the RV and took a deep, steadying breath. I realized that my journey was not about erasing the past, but learning to live with it, transforming guilt and regret into lessons of resilience and strength. The forest, with all its eerie echoes and haunted memories, had forced me to confront the parts of myself I'd long denied. And in doing so, it had given me a chance at renewal. On the final day of my retreat, I packed up the RV and took one last drive through Vengeful National Forest. The landscape, once shrouded in oppressive darkness, now seemed to hold a quiet promise of a new beginning. I knew that the doppelganger, the embodiment of my darkest self, might never completely vanish. Instead, it would linger like an echo, a reminder of the fragile balance between our inner demons and our capacity for redemption. As I navigated the winding roads back to civilization, I felt a cautious optimism seep into my bones. I had faced my past in a way I never thought possible. I had wrestled with the specter of my guilt, and in that struggle, had discovered the strength to move forward. The ghost town, the carvings, and even the haunting figure in the mirror had all played their part in this transformative journey. Now, when I catch my reflection in a window or see a shadow in the corner of my eye, I no longer recoil in fear. Instead, I greet it with a silent acknowledgement, a reminder of the path I've walked and the man I am becoming. My time in Vengeful National Forest taught me that true healing is not a destination, but a continuous journey of self-discovery, where even the darkest echoes of our past can eventually become the catalysts for redemption. I left the forest that winter not with a sense of completion, but with the understanding that the inner battle is eternal. Yet, I also carried with me the hope that every man, no matter how burdened by regret, has the power to confront his inner darkness and emerge stronger. My name is Julian, and at 45 I have learned that while our inner demons may never entirely disappear, they can be tamed through acceptance, courage, and the unyielding will to transform despair into a quiet resolve for renewal. Every time I drive my RV now, I remember the haunted roads of Vengeful and the ghost town that challenged me to face my most painful truths. And while the eerie echoes of my doppelganger may still appear in fleeting moments, they no longer signal my downfall, but rather mark the progress of a man who dared to confront his past, embrace his imperfections, and finally find a path toward redemption in the silent, watchful heart of the wilderness.